A Navy SEAL, this is a joke. She doesn't belong in my ring and I'll break her in half to prove it. Sergeant Mason Caldwell roared the words as he slammed his fist into the metal locker, denting the steel, splitting his own knuckles open. He spun toward the crowd of soldiers, blood dripping from his hand, jabbing his finger at the competitor list like a weapon. And standing 20 feet away, close enough to hear the crack of bone on metal, and every ugly word that followed, was the woman he had just sworn to destroy. Lieutenant Emily Carter did not blink. She watched the blood drip from his hand and said nothing. Before we go any further, I want to invite you to subscribe to the channel and follow this story all the way to the end, because what happens over the next 2 hours will surprise you in ways you cannot imagine right now. And while you're here, do me a small favor. Leave a comment and tell me the city where you're watching from so I can see just how far this story of mine has traveled. Now let's begin. The morning air at Fort Liberty, North Carolina was thick and heavy, the kind of southern heat that pressed down on a man's shoulders before the sun had even climbed halfway up the sky. More than 500 soldiers had gathered from every branch of the United States military, and they had come for one reason: the annual Elite Combat Readiness Challenge. It was the biggest joint training event of the year, and every soldier who stepped onto that base knew exactly what it meant. This was not a game. This was where reputations were built and destroyed. This was where a man found out what he was truly made of when everything else was stripped away. For years, one name had stood above all the others: Sergeant Mason Caldwell. He was 38 years old, and he had spent nearly 2 decades turning himself into a weapon. He was a legend on that base, an Army instructor with an undefeated record in the combat challenge and a reputation as one of the toughest men anyone had ever trained under. When Mason walked through the mess hall, younger soldiers straightened their backs. When Mason spoke, men listened. He had earned that. Nobody could take it from him. And that was exactly the problem, because a man who has never lost begins to believe he never can. Mason had grown up hard. His father had been a drill sergeant of the old school, a man who believed that softness was a disease and that the only cure was pain. Mason had learned early that the world respected strength and mocked weakness, and he had built his entire life around never being on the wrong side of that line. He had made himself the strongest man in every room he entered, and he had never once questioned whether there might be another kind of strength that he had never bothered to learn. That morning, when the official competitor list was posted on the board outside the training compound, a small crowd gathered around it. Names scrolled down the paper in neat military print: Army, Marines, Air Force. And then near the bottom, one name that made the whole crowd go quiet: Lieutenant Emily Carter, United States Navy SEAL, a 26-year-old woman entering a competition that had been dominated by elite male soldiers for as long as anyone could remember. The reactions came in waves. A few of the older soldiers raised their eyebrows and said nothing the way men do when they have learned to keep their opinions to themselves. A handful of the younger ones started whispering. And then there were those who had done their homework, who had heard the stories, who knew that a woman did not simply walk into SEAL training and walk out again without leaving pieces of herself on the ground. Those men were curious. Some of them were even a little impressed. They had heard that Emily Carter had graduated near the top of her training class, that she had completed multiple classified operations, that she had earned every single thing she wore on her uniform. But Mason Caldwell was not one of those men. He pushed his way to the front of the crowd and he looked at the name and he laughed. It was not a small laugh. It was loud, deliberate, and meant to be heard by everyone within 30 feet. He turned to the men around him and he said the words that would follow him for the rest of his life. A Navy SEAL, more like a publicity stunt. She doesn't belong in this ring. Some of the younger soldiers laughed with him because that is what young soldiers do when a legend makes a joke. But most of them just looked uncomfortable, because standing behind Mason close enough that there was no possible way she hadn't heard was Lieutenant Emily Carter herself. She was not a large woman. She stood 5'7", lean and quiet, with dark hair pulled back tight and eyes that seemed to take in everything without giving anything away. She wore her uniform the way a person wears their own skin, without a single wasted motion. She had heard every word Mason said, and she did not argue. That was the first thing that surprised the men who were watching. They expected her to fire back, to defend herself, to raise her voice. That was what people did when they were insulted in front of a crowd. But Emily Carter did none of those things. She simply walked toward Mason unhurried, and she stopped a few feet in front of him, and she looked up at him with a calm that was almost unsettling. "You don't have to believe I belong here," she said. Her voice was quiet, but somehow every person nearby heard it. You just have to step into the ring with me. The crowd went silent. Mason blinked. For just a moment, something flickered across his face, something he would never have admitted to. It was not fear. He was too proud for fear. But it was the shadow of a thought. He did not like the thought that this woman did not seem the least bit intimidated by him. And Mason Caldwell had spent 20 years making sure that everyone was intimidated by him. He recovered quickly. He smiled again, that same cold smile, and he shook his head slowly. Sweetheart, he said, I've broken men twice your size. I'd hate to see what happens to you. Then don't watch, Emily said, and she turned and walked away. She did not look back. She did not raise her chin in triumph. She simply left the way a person leaves a conversation that is already over. And Mason stood there in the middle of the crowd, and for the first time in a very long time, he felt the eyes of the men around him and could not quite tell what they were thinking. That evening in the barracks that had been set aside for the female competitors, Emily sat on the edge of her bunk and unlaced her boots. There were only 4 women in the entire competition, and the other 3 were housed in a different section of the base. Emily was alone in her small corner of the world, and that was fine with her. She had spent a great deal of her life alone. She had learned long ago that being alone and being lonely were 2 very different things, and that a person who could not tell them apart would never survive what she had survived. There was a knock at the door. Emily looked up, and a woman she recognized stepped inside. Commander Rachel Morgan was in her late 40s, with silver threading through her short hair and a scar along her jaw that she had never explained to anyone. She had been Emily's mentor for the better part of 6 years, ever since Emily had been a raw, furious young officer trying to prove that she could do the impossible. Rachel had seen something in her then. She had never fully explained what it was. I heard what Caldwell said, Rachel said, closing the door behind her. Emily kept unlacing her boot. So did about 400 other people. Rachel sat down on the bunk across from her. You didn't take the bait. No, good. Rachel studied her for a long moment. But I know you, Emily. You did not take the bait because you didn't care. You didn't take the bait because you've already decided something. So tell me what you decided. Emily set her boot down carefully on the floor. She was quiet for a moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady and even. I decided that men like Mason Caldwell don't learn from words, she said. They only learn one way. Rachel let out a slow breath. Emily, listen to me. He's dangerous. I've watched his matches. He doesn't just win, he hurts people. He enjoys it. There's a difference between a fighter and a man who needs to break people to feel like himself, and Mason is the second kind. If you get in that ring with him, he is going to try to end you, and he's not going to care if he crosses a line to do it. Emily looked at her mentor, and for a moment something softened in her eyes. You think I don't know that? I think you know it, Rachel said. I just want to be sure you're not walking in there to prove something to him. Because a fighter who fights to prove something is a fighter who's already lost. Emily was quiet for a long time, and then she said something that Rachel would remember for the rest of her life. I'm not fighting to prove anything to him, Emily said. I stopped needing men like him to believe in me a long time ago. But there are 200 young soldiers on this base who watched him laugh at me today, and half of them believed him. And I know exactly how that feels, Rachel. I know what it does to a person to be laughed at before they have been given a chance. So no, I'm not doing this for Mason Caldwell. She paused. I'm doing it for the kid in the back of that crowd who's been told his whole life that he isn't enough. I want him to see what happens when you refuse to accept somebody else's opinion as your ceiling. Rachel didn't say anything for a while. Then she reached out and put a hand on Emily's shoulder, and she nodded. Your father would be proud of you, she said quietly. Something moved across Emily's face at the mention of her father, a flicker of grief and love, so brief that anyone else would have missed it. But Rachel didn't miss it. She had known Emily long enough to know that her father was the center of everything, the foundation that everything else was built on. Emily's father had been a Navy SEAL. Master Chief David Carter had served for 22 years, and he had come home from those years a quieter man than the one who had left. Emily had grown up watching him, learning from him, absorbing the lessons he taught, not through lectures, but through the way he lived. He had taught her how to shoot before she could drive. He had taught her how to hold her breath underwater until her lungs screamed. But the most important thing he had ever taught her had nothing to do with any of that. She remembered the day clearly, even though she had only been 14. A boy at her school, older and bigger, had been tormenting a smaller kid for weeks. Emily had finally lost her temper and gotten into a fight with him, and she had come home with a split lip and a suspension. She had expected her father to be angry. Instead, he had sat down across from her at the kitchen table and looked at her for a long time. "Were you angry when you hit him?" he had asked. "Yes," Emily had said. "He deserved it." Her father had nodded slowly. "Maybe he did. But listen to me, Emily, because this is the most important thing I will ever tell you." He had leaned forward. "Anyone can hit someone when they're angry. That takes nothing. Anger is easy. Losing control is easy. Do you understand? The whole world is full of people who lose control." He had tapped to the table. "Real strength isn't about hurting people. Real strength is being the one person in the room who stays in control when everyone else has lost it. The strongest person is never the one who hits the hardest. It's the one who knows exactly who they are, even when the whole world is screaming at them to become someone else." Emily had carried those words with her for 12 years. Through the hardest days of SEAL training, when instructors had screamed in her face that she would never make it, that a woman had no place among them, that she should quit and save herself the humiliation. She had carried her father's words through freezing water and endless nights and moments when her own body had begged her to give up. She had carried them through operations she could never speak about, through decisions made in fractions of a second where a wrong choice meant someone died. And she had never once forgotten them. Her father had passed away 18 months ago, a heart attack quick and merciless in the garden he had loved. Emily had been on the other side of the world when it happened, and she had not been able to say goodbye. That was a wound that had not healed, and perhaps never would. But she carried him with her still in every calm breath she took when the world wanted her to panic. That night, lying in her bunk in the darkness, Emily thought about Mason Caldwell and his laughter. She did not feel anger. That surprised even her. She had learned to notice the absence of anger the way another person might notice the absence of pain. Instead, she felt something almost like sadness, because she recognized Mason. Not the man himself, but the type. She had met 100 Mason Caldwells in her life. Men who had been taught somewhere along the way that their entire worth was measured by their ability to dominate others. Men who had never learned that there was any other way to be strong. And she knew that men like that were not truly powerful. They were terrified. They were terrified every single day that someone would come along and expose the truth that the strength they had built their whole lives around was hollow. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow the competition would begin, and she would let her actions speak the way she always had. The first day of the Elite Combat Readiness Challenge began before dawn. Soldiers gathered in the massive training facility, a converted aircraft hangar with a raised combat platform in the center, and bleachers packed with observers. The event ran in stages, testing endurance and tactical thinking in the morning, and moving to the hand-to-hand combat brackets in the afternoon. It was the combat brackets that everyone had come to see. Mason Caldwell dominated his early matches as everyone expected. He was brutal and efficient, ending his fights quickly, and he made sure to look up into the crowd after each victory, soaking in the noise. He was performing. Every gesture was for the audience, and every time he finished a match, his eyes would drift across the arena, searching until he found the one person he was really performing for. Emily Carter sitting quietly in the corner, watching him with an expression he could not read. That expression bothered him more than he wanted to admit. He was used to people looking at him with fear or admiration. He did not know what to do with a person who looked at him the way Emily did, as though she were watching a problem she had already solved. When it was Emily's turn to fight, the entire hangar seemed to lean forward. Her first opponent was a Marine named Derek Voss, a mountain of a man who outweighed her by nearly 40 pounds. He was fast for his size and known for overwhelming his opponents with sheer aggression. The men in the crowd murmured among themselves. Most of them expected this to be over in seconds. Some of them were already looking away, unwilling to watch what they assumed would be an ugly one-sided beating. Mason leaned against a support beam near the platform, arms crossed, a smirk already forming. "Watch," he said to the soldiers around him. "This is going to be quick." He was right. It was quick, just not the way he expected. The referee signaled the start, and Derek Voss came forward like a freight train, exactly as everyone knew he would. Emily did not meet his charge. She did not try to match his power. She moved just slightly, redirecting his momentum, and Derek stumbled past her. He recovered fast and came again. Again, Emily moved. She was not fighting him. She was reading him. Every soldier who understood combat could see it in the first 20 seconds. She was studying his rhythm, learning the pattern of his aggression, cataloging every tell he did not know he had. Derek grew frustrated. Frustration made him faster and sloppier. He lunged trying to grab her, trying to use his size to end the fight. And that was the moment Emily had been waiting for. She stepped inside his reach, controlled. His arms shifted her weight in a way that seemed almost gentle and used his own forward momentum to take him off his feet and pin him to the mat. It happened so smoothly that the crowd did not fully understand what they had seen until it was over. The referee slapped the mat. The match was called. For a moment, the hanger was silent, and then a strange sound began to build. It was applause, scattered at first, uncertain, and then growing. The men who had come to watch her fail were slowly, reluctantly standing up. Mason Caldwell did not applaud. He stood against his beam with his arms crossed, and the smirk was gone from his face. He watched Emily help Derek Voss back to his feet, watched her say something quiet to the big Marine that made him nod, watched her walk off the platform without a single gesture of celebration. And for the first time, a small, cold feeling began to move in Mason's chest. He recognized skill when he saw it. He had spent 20 years learning to recognize it, and what he had just watched was not luck. Beginner's luck, he said out loud to no one in particular. But even he did not quite believe it. The day went on. Match after match, Emily advanced, and a pattern emerged that began to unsettle the entire base. She was never the strongest fighter in any of her matches. She was never the biggest, but she was always, without exception, the calmest. While her opponents burned through their energy in bursts of aggression, Emily conserved everything. While they let frustration cloud their judgment, Emily remained clear. She fought the way water moves, giving way where force was applied and finding the path that force could not block. And one by one, the strongest men in the competition found themselves flat on the mat, staring up at the lights, wondering how they had gotten there. Something began to shift in the crowd throughout that first day. The men who had laughed at Emily Carter in the morning were not laughing by the afternoon. There is a particular kind of respect that soldiers give to competence, a respect that cannot be faked or demanded, and Emily was earning it in front of all of them. Young privates who had chuckled at Mason's joke now watched her matches in total silence, leaning forward trying to understand what she was doing. Because she was doing something they had never been taught. She was winning without rage. Commander Rachel Morgan watched from the sidelines, and there was a quiet pride in her eyes that she did not bother to hide. She knew what she was watching. She had seen it develop over 6 years. Emily Carter fought like her father had trained her to fight, which was to say she fought like a person who had made peace with fear. Most fighters were driven by something, anger or ego or the desperate need to prove themselves. Emily was driven by none of those things. She had burned all of that away a long time ago in cold water and darkness, and what was left was something rare, pure discipline, pure clarity, a person who knew exactly who she was. During the lunch break, Mason Caldwell did something he almost never did. He sat alone in a corner of the mess hall with a tablet, and he watched footage of Emily's matches. He watched them over and over, and as he watched, the cold feeling in his chest grew. Because he was a professional, and a professional could see what an amateur could not. He could see that Emily was not lucky. Every single thing she did was intentional. She was reading her opponents the way a chess master reads a board 3 and 4 moves ahead, and by the time they realized what was happening, it was already over. A young private named Tyler Brooks sat down across from Mason. Tyler was 19, fresh out of training, one of the young soldiers who had laughed loudest at Mason's joke the day before. He idolized Mason. He wanted to be Mason. And so he was surprised to see the great sergeant looking so serious. "She's good, huh?" Tyler said, trying to sound casual. Mason didn't look up from the tablet. "She's good," he admitted quietly. Tyler blinked. He had never heard Mason admit that anyone was good. "You're still going to smoke her, though, right? If you two end up fighting." Mason was silent for a long moment. On the screen, Emily was taking down a soldier who outweighed her by 50 pounds. "You watch her," Mason said finally. "Tell me what you see." Tyler leaned in and watched. "I see her winning." "Look closer." Mason rewound the footage. "Watch her feet. Watch her eyes. She's not reacting. You understand? Everybody else in this competition is reacting. They see an attack, they respond. But she's not doing that. She already knows the attack is coming before it starts. She's watching for it. She sets a trap and she waits for you to walk into it. He set the tablet down. I've been fighting for 20 years, kid. I have never fought anybody who does that. Tyler didn't know what to say. This was not the Mason he knew. The Mason he knew was invincible, untouchable, certain. This Mason looked almost afraid. But you're not scared of her, Tyler said. It came out as half a question. Mason picked up the tablet again. I'm scared of nothing, he said. But the words came out flat, rehearsed the words of a man saying something because he had always said it, not because he still believed it. That was the moment, though no one witnessed it, and Mason himself would never admit it when the fear truly took root in him. Because Mason Caldwell had built his entire identity on being unbeatable. Every relationship he had, every ounce of respect he commanded, every reason he had for getting up in the morning, all of it rested on that single foundation. Mason wins. Mason is the strongest. And now, for the first time in his adult life, he was watching someone who might be able to take that away from him. Not through greater strength, which he could have accepted, but through something he did not possess and had never bothered to develop. Through discipline, through calm, through knowing herself. And a man whose entire identity rests on a single foundation will do almost anything to keep that foundation from cracking. That evening, as the first day of competition ended, the brackets were updated. Emily had advanced through her entire section without a single loss. Mason had done the same through his. There was only one place their paths could possibly meet now, the final match of the entire competition. And every soldier on the base understood it at the same moment, looking at the updated bracket on the board. If both of them kept winning, Emily Carter and Mason Caldwell would face each other for the championship. The whispers spread through Fort Liberty like fire through dry grass. Some men were excited, some were nervous. A few were angry, still clinging to the belief that a woman had no business being in that final. But everyone without exception wanted to see it happen. Everyone wanted the question answered. Could she beat him? Could Emily Carter actually beat Mason Caldwell? That night, Mason could not sleep. He lay in his quarters and stared at the ceiling, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, his mind would not go quiet. He kept seeing the footage. He kept seeing Emily's face, that calm, unreadable expression, the way she had looked at him when she said, "You just have to step into the ring with me." He had spent his whole life making other people feel small, and he had never once stopped to wonder whether he was actually strong or merely surrounded by people who were too afraid to test him. And now the test was coming, and he did not know the answer. There was a knock on his door. It was Tyler Brooks along with two other young soldiers. They had come, Mason realized, to reassure themselves, to hear their hero tell them that everything was going to be fine, that the natural order of things would hold. "Sergeant," Tyler said, "the whole base is talking about the final. Everybody's saying it's going to be you and her." He hesitated. "You're going to put her in her place, right?" Mason looked at the three young faces in his doorway, and he understood something in that moment that he did not want to understand. These boys did not admire him for who he was. They admired him for what he represented. The certainty that strength always wins. And if he lost, he would be taking something from them too. He would be teaching them a lesson that would follow them for the rest of their lives. "Get some sleep," Mason said, "all of you." He shut the door before they could ask him anything else. And he stood there in the dark for a long time alone with a feeling he did not have a name for because he had spent 20 years making sure he never had to feel it. Across the base in her small corner of the barracks, Emily Carter slept soundly. She did not lie awake wondering whether she could win. She did not replay footage or worry about the crowd or think about Mason Caldwell at all. She had done what she always did before something difficult. She had prepared as well as she could, and then she had let it go. Her father had taught her that too. You do the work, and then you release it, because worry is just fear pretending to be productive. She breathed slowly in the darkness, and she thought of her father's face, and she felt him close the way she always did in the quiet hours. Somewhere in her dreams, she was 14 again at the kitchen table, and her father was leaning forward, telling her the thing that had shaped every day of her life since. The strongest person is never the one who hits the hardest. It's the one who knows exactly who they are. Tomorrow, 500 soldiers would gather to find out which of them that was. And when the second day of the Elite Combat Readiness Challenge dawned over Fort Liberty, The whole base felt it in the air, a tension that had not been there before, a sense that something was coming that would not be forgotten. The bleachers filled early. Soldiers who were not even competing came just to watch. Word had spread beyond the combat teams through the mess halls, and the barracks, and the command offices, and now the entire installation was talking about one thing and one thing only: the woman and the sergeant, the seal and the legend. Emily arrived at the hangar early, moving through her preparations with the same quiet focus she brought to everything. Rachel found her in a side room wrapping her hands. "How are you feeling?" Rachel asked. "The same as always," Emily said. Rachel watched her for a moment. "He's going to come after you today before your bracket even meets. He's going to try to get in your head. Men like Mason, when they're scared, they start early." Emily finished wrapping her right hand and flexed her fingers. "Then let him try," she said. "You can't get inside a house that has no doors." Rachel laughed despite herself. "Your father used to say things like that." "He said exactly that," Emily replied, and for just a moment, a small, real smile touched her face. Word for word. And she was right about one thing. Mason did come for her. He found her in the corridor outside the combat floor, waiting until she was alone, and he stepped in front of her with his arms crossed, and that old, cold smile pulled across his face like a mask. He was tired of wearing, but did not know how to take off. "You've had a good run," Mason said. "I'll give you that. You beat some soft opponents, made yourself a little fan club." He leaned in slightly. "But you and I both know how this ends. When you get in that ring with me, all of that goes away. There's no reading me. There's no clever little tricks. There's just you and me, and I am going to hurt you, and everyone is going to watch." Emily looked up at him. She did not step back. She did not raise her voice. She simply looked at him with those calm, steady eyes, and what she said next landed harder than any punch could have. "You keep saying you're going to hurt me," she said quietly. "You've said it 3 times now. A man who's sure of himself doesn't have to say it even once." She let that sit for a moment, watching it register in his eyes. "You're not trying to scare me, Mason. You're trying to convince yourself. And we both heard it just now. It didn't work." For a moment, Mason Caldwell had absolutely nothing to say. His mouth opened, and then it closed. She had reached past everything, past 20 years of armor, and touched the one thing he had spent his whole life hiding. And she had done it without raising her voice, without a trace of cruelty, as though she were simply telling him a fact about the weather. Emily stepped around him and walked toward the combat floor. And this time it was Mason who was left standing alone in the corridor, watching her go, feeling the ground shift beneath everything he thought he knew about himself. She had not beaten him yet. The final was still hours away, and both of them still had matches to win before they ever reached it. But something had already been decided in that corridor, something that had nothing to do with strength or skill. Emily Carter had looked into the heart of the strongest man on the base, and she had seen the frightened person hiding inside, and she had told him the truth about himself. And a man who has spent his whole life running from the truth does not know what to do when it finally catches him. The matches began, and all across Fort Liberty, 500 soldiers turned their eyes toward the combat platform, waiting to see whether the woman nobody had expected was about to do the one thing nobody believed was possible. The matches began, and within the first hour, the entire tone of the day had changed. Emily Carter fought 3 opponents in rapid succession, and each time the crowd expected her luck to finally run out, and each time she walked off the platform without a mark on her. But it was her second match of the morning that made men stop talking and start watching, because her opponent was a soldier named Cole Ramirez, an Army Combatives champion from another base who had come to Fort Liberty specifically to win this competition. Ramirez had studied her. He had watched every one of her matches from the day before, and he had built a plan around one idea. Do not let her read you. Do not settle into a rhythm. Attack from angles she cannot predict, and never give her the pattern she is waiting for. For the first 90 seconds, it worked. Ramirez kept Emily moving, kept her defending, refused to commit to anything she could exploit. And for the first time in the entire competition, the crowd saw Emily Carter on the back foot. A murmur ran through the hangar. Mason Caldwell, watching from the far corner, felt something loosen in his chest, something dangerously close to hope. But Emily was not panicking. She was learning, and 90 seconds was all she needed. Ramirez threw a feint he had used twice already, and on the third time Emily was there before it finished, catching his wrist, turning her hip, and dropping him to the mat with a control so precise it looked almost gentle. The referee slapped the floor. The match was over. Ramirez lay there for a moment staring at the lights, and then he did something that stunned the crowd. He laughed. He got to his feet, shook his head, and extended his hand to her. "I planned for 6 weeks," he said, loud enough for the front rows to hear. "You solved me in 90 seconds. It's an honor." The applause that followed was not scattered this time. It was the whole hangar. Mason Caldwell did not applaud. He turned and walked out of the room, and Tyler Brooks, watching him go, felt the first real crack appear in the image of the man he had worshipped. 12 minutes into the morning, and Emily Carter had already beaten the one opponent everyone had believed might stop her. And now there was truly nothing standing between her and the final except Mason himself. Mason went to a supply room at the back of the facility and shut the door and stood there breathing hard, though he had not thrown a single punch. He caught his reflection in the small mirror on the wall, and for a moment he did not recognize the man looking back at him. There was something in his own eyes he had spent 20 years making sure no one would ever see. He looked away from it. There was a knock, and Rachel Morgan stepped inside before he could answer. She closed the door behind her. She was the only person on the base who was not afraid of Mason Caldwell, and they both knew it. "You watched Ramirez," she said. It was not a question. "I watched," Mason said. "He's the best combatives fighter in 3 states. And she made him look like a recruit." Rachel let that sit for a second. "I've known you a long time, Mason, longer than most people on this base. So I'm going to tell you something, and I'm going to say it once. Walk away from the final." Mason turned to face her slowly. "Say that again." "Withdraw," Rachel said. "Cite an old injury. Nobody would question it. You've got a 20-year record. You can end this competition with your reputation whole and never step into that ring." "You want me to quit?" His voice was very quiet now, which was more dangerous than when it was loud. "You want me to run from a 26-year-old woman in front of 500 soldiers. I want you to survive the next 24 hours as the man you are," Rachel said, "instead of finding out who you become when she takes the one thing you've got left." She stepped closer. "I've watched you fight for years, Mason. You don't fight to win. You fight to break people. And that's fine when the other person breaks. But she's not going to break, and I've seen what men like you do when the breaking doesn't work. You reach for something you can't take back." For a long moment, the two of them stood in silence. "Get out," Mason said finally. Rachel looked at him with something that was almost pity, and then she nodded slowly and left. And Mason stood alone in that supply room, and the thing in the mirror was still there, and this time he could not look away from it fast enough. By late morning, the brackets had thinned to the final 4, and the tension in the hangar had become something you could almost hold in your hands. Emily had one more match before the final. So did Mason, and a strange thing had begun to happen in the crowd, something that had never happened at the Elite Combat Readiness Challenge before. The soldiers had started choosing sides, and it was not breaking down the way anyone would have predicted. The men who had laughed the loudest at Mason's joke, the young ones who idolized him, some of them were now quietly, almost secretly hoping Emily would win. And they hated themselves a little for it because it felt like betrayal. But they had watched her for a day and a half now, and they had seen something they could not unsee. They had seen a person who refused to be provoked, who won without cruelty, who helped her beaten opponents to their feet. And somewhere in the back of every one of those young men was a memory of being small, of being laughed at, of being told they were not enough. And watching Emily, they saw what it looked like to answer that with something other than rage. Tyler Brooks stood at the rail near the platform, and he was more confused than he had ever been in his life. 2 days ago, the world had been simple. Mason was the strongest. The strongest wins. That was the whole of it. But now his hero was hiding in supply rooms and denting lockers with his fists, and the woman Mason had promised to break was walking through the strongest men on the base like they were standing still, and doing it with a calm that Tyler could not stop thinking about. His friend, a private named Aton, elbowed him. "You still think Caldwell smokes her?" Tyler didn't answer right away. Then he said something that surprised even himself. "I don't know anymore." "You don't know," Dax laughed. 2 days ago, you'd have fought anybody who said different." 2 days ago, I didn't know anything," Tyler said quietly, and he went back to watching Emily wrap her hands for her semifinal. Her semifinal opponent was a soldier named Bishop, and Bishop was a problem. He was not the biggest man in the competition, but he was the most technical after Ramirez, And unlike Ramirez, Bishop was patient. He did not rush. He did not overcommit. He fought the way Emily fought, waiting, reading, refusing to give away his pattern. For the first time in the entire tournament, Emily faced someone who was trying to do to her exactly what she did to everyone else. The match was slow. It was tense. Neither of them moved for long stretches, circling, testing each, waiting for the other to make the first mistake. The crowd, which had grown used to Emily's quick finishes, went absolutely silent because they could feel that this was different. This was two disciplined minds locked against each other, and it was going to come down to a single moment. That moment came 4 minutes in. Bishop shifted his weight almost imperceptibly, a tell so small that no one in the crowd caught it. But Emily caught it. She had been watching for exactly that for 4 minutes, and she moved. But so did Bishop, because it had been a trap. For one heart-stopping second, Emily Carter was caught. Bishop had baited her with a false tell, and now he had her arm and he was turning, and the entire hangar drew a single sharp breath because it looked for the first time like she was going to lose. And then Emily did something no one expected. She did not fight the lock. She went with it. She rolled into the direction Bishop was pulling faster than he had planned for, and the momentum he had been counting on to trap her became the momentum that undid him. She flowed out of his grip, reversed the position, and had him controlled on the mat before he understood what had happened. The referee slapped the floor. The hangar erupted. Bishop lay there for a second, and then he started to laugh, the same helpless, admiring laugh Ramirez had laughed. "You let me think it worked," he said, breathing hard. "You saw the trap, and you walked into it anyway because you already knew how to get out." Emily helped him up. "You almost had me," she said, and she meant it, and Bishop could tell she meant it, and that made him respect her even more. She had done it. She had reached the final. And now the only thing left in the entire competition was the one fight everyone had been waiting for since the moment the competitor list went up on the board. Emily against Mason. But the final was not until the afternoon, and there were still hours to fill, and it was in those hours that the story of the Elite Combat Readiness Challenge became something much larger and much darker than a competition. Because during the lunch break, Mason Caldwell made a decision. He sat alone again with his tablet, watching the footage of Emily beating Bishop, and the fear that had been growing in him for 2 days finally crystallized into something else. He understood now with total clarity that he could not beat her the way he beat everyone else. He could not overpower her. He could not out-endure her. He could not break her spirit because her spirit did not work the way other people's spirits worked. There was nothing to break. And a man like Mason Caldwell, faced with an opponent he genuinely could not defeat, did not accept it. He looked for another way, and the other way was always the same way. If you cannot win clean, you win dirty. He began to plan. Not consciously, not in words he would have admitted to himself, but somewhere underneath his thoughts, a decision was forming. He would get her in that ring, and he would find the moment, and he would end her before she could do to him what she had done to everyone else. He told himself it was just intensity, just competitiveness, just being willing to do what it took. He did not use the word that Rachel had used. He did not say to himself, "I am going to reach for something I can't take back." But that was exactly what he was preparing to do. 22 minutes past noon, and the villain of this story had stopped being merely arrogant and had become something worse. A frightened man who had decided that his fear justified anything. Emily spent the lunch break in the quiet side room, and Rachel came and sat with her, and for a while neither of them said anything. Then Rachel spoke, and her voice was heavier than Emily had ever heard it. "I went to him," Rachel said. "This morning. I asked him to withdraw." Emily looked up. "You did what?" "I asked Mason to walk away from the final." Rachel rubbed her face with both hands. "I know how that sounds. I know you can beat him." "That's not why I did it." She looked at Emily directly. "I did it because I'm scared of what he'll do when he realizes he's losing. I've watched that man fight for 6 years, Emily. He doesn't just want to win. He needs the other person to be beaten. And when someone won't be beaten, something in him comes loose. I've seen it twice. Both times somebody got hurt worse than they should have. And both times Mason found a way to call it an accident." Emily was quiet for a moment. "You think he'll try to seriously hurt me?" "I think," Rachel said slowly, "that when Mason Caldwell understands he cannot win, he will decide that if he cannot beat you, he can at least make sure you never fight again. And he will do it in a way that looks like the flow of the match. He is very good at that. He has had a lot of practice. Emily absorbed this. She did not look afraid, but she did look serious in a way she had not before. Then I'll have to be ready for it, she said. Emily. Rachel reached out and gripped her arm. You don't have to do this. There's no shame in walking away from a man who's decided he'd rather hurt you than lose to you. That's not cowardice. That's wisdom. Emily put her hand over Rachel's, and when she spoke, her voice was gentle, but there was iron underneath it. You remember what I told you the first night about the kid in the back of the crowd who's been told he isn't enough? Rachel nodded. If I walk away now, Emily said, the lesson that kid learns is that when a strong man threatens you badly enough, you should run. And I am not going to teach him that. I would rather get hurt teaching him the truth than stay safe teaching him a lie. She squeezed Rachel's hand. My father didn't raise me to run from Mason Caldwell. He raised me to be the one person in the room who stays in control while everyone else loses it. So I'm going to go out there, and I'm going to stay in control, and I'm going to let Mason lose his. And whatever he decides to do with that, I'll be ready. Rachel looked at her for a long time, and then she let out a slow breath, and she nodded because she had known Emily long enough to know that once she had decided something like this, there was no changing it. And then I'll be right there, she said, the whole time. And if he crosses a line, so help me, I will stop that match myself, referee or no referee. I know you will, Emily said softly. And that was when the big twist came. The thing that changed the entire competition, the thing that no one in that hangar could have predicted. Because as they sat there, the door opened and a young private stepped in, pale and out of breath. It was Tyler Brooks. And Tyler Brooks was the last person on the base anyone would have expected to seek Emily out. He stood in the doorway and he looked at Emily, and he looked like a young man who was doing something that terrified him. Lieutenant Carter, he said, I need to tell you something. And I don't know if I should because Sergeant Caldwell, he's like a hero to me, or he was, and this feels like I don't know what this feels like. He swallowed. But I heard him just now in the equipment room. He was talking to two of the other instructors, guys he's close with, and he didn't know I was there. Emily went very still. What did he say, Tyler? Tyler's voice dropped. He said when he gets you on the ground, he's going to make it look like you resisted his submission. He said there's a way to torque a leg so it looks like the other person caused their own injury by fighting the hold wrong. He said by the time anybody figures out what happened, it'll be over and the footage will back him up because it'll look like your own fault. Dicker's hands were shaking. He said he's not going to lose to a woman in front of the whole base. He said he'd rather end her career than lose his reputation. Those were his words, end her career. The room went silent. Rachel was on her feet. That's it. That's enough. Emily, we go to the command staff right now. We report this. We get him disqualified. We don't let him anywhere near you. But Emily did not move. She was looking at Tyler, and there was something in her face that neither of them expected. She was not afraid. She was almost strangely calm. Tyler, she said quietly, why did you come and tell me this? Tyler looked lost. Ma'am, you idolize him. You said so yourself. Coming here telling me this, you're betraying the man you looked up to your whole career. So why did you do it? Tyler was quiet for the long moment, and then in a voice that cracked, he said something that changed him from a boy into a man. Because 2 days ago, I laughed when he said you didn't belong here. I laughed, ma'am. And then I watched you fight, and I watched you pick up every person you beat off the floor, and I watched you fight clean when you could have fought mean. And then I heard him planning to cripple you on purpose so he wouldn't have to lose. He wiped his eyes angrily, and I realized the man I was cheering for isn't strong. He's the weakest person in this whole building, and you're the strongest. And I don't want to be the kind of man who stays quiet because the truth is inconvenient. So I came here, even though I'm scared of what happens to me if he finds out. Emily stood up slowly. She crossed the room and she put a hand on Tyler's shoulder, and she looked at him with a warmth that made the young private's throat tighten. You just did the hardest thing a person can do, she said. You told the truth about someone you love because it was the right thing. Your parents raised a good man, Tyler. Don't ever let anybody, including yourself, make you forget that. Tyler nodded, unable to speak. And Rachel, watching this, said again more urgently, Emily, we have his intent now. We have a witness. We go to command. We end this without you ever having to step in that ring. And here was where Emily made the choice that would define everything that came after. She turned to Rachel and she shook her head slowly. "No," she said. "No." Rachel stared at her. "Emily, he just told 2 witnesses he plans to end your career. That's not competition. That's assault. Why would you get in a ring with a man who's planning that?" "Because if we report it," Emily said, "it's my word and Tyler's word against Mason's and his 2 friends. You know how this base works, Rachel. You know his record. You know how much they've invested in him. Best case, they postpone the match, they investigate for weeks, and Mason walks away with a cloud over him, but no answer. And every soldier who watched me get to the final never gets to see the truth. Mason gets to spend the rest of his life telling people he would have beaten me if they hadn't canceled the fight." She shook her head. "No, he wants to hurt me in that ring because he's decided that's his only way to win. So I'm going to give him the ring, and I'm going to be ready for exactly the move Tyler just described. And when he reaches for it, I'm going to be 1 step ahead of him, the way I've been 1 step ahead of every man I've fought this whole tournament. And 500 people are going to watch him try to cripple a person who never did anything but fight fair. And they're going to watch it fail." Rachel was quiet. "That's a terrible risk." "It's a calculated one," Emily said. "There's a difference. My father taught me that too." She looked at Tyler. "But I want you to do one thing for me, Tyler. I want you to tell Commander Morgan exactly what you told me in writing right now before the match. Not to stop it, to protect the truth. So that after it's over, when Mason tries to twist what happened, there's a record that says he planned it in advance. You understand? We don't use it to run. We use it to make sure the truth survives." Tyler nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am, I'll write it down, every word." 38 minutes past noon, and the final match of the Elite Combat Readiness Challenge had transformed into something no one in the hangar fully understood yet. It was no longer a competition. It was a trap. But the trap was not the one Mason thought he was setting. He believed he was luring Emily into a ring where he could destroy her under the cover of the match. He did not know that she now knew exactly what he was planning. He did not know that the very move he was so proud of, the move he had practiced and refined and used to hurt people before, had already been described to his opponent in complete detail. He was walking into the ring believing he held a secret weapon, and the weapon was already known. Rachel took Tyler to a quiet corner and had him write his statement, and she watched over him while he did it, and when he was finished, she read it twice and folded it and put it inside her jacket against her chest, where it would not leave her the entire match. And then she came back to Emily and she looked at her former student, the young, furious officer she had shaped into this calm, formidable woman, and she felt a fear she had not felt in years, and underneath the fear, a fierce and aching pride. "If I see him reach for it," Rachel said, "I'm stopping the match. I don't care what you say." "I know," Emily said, "and I'm counting on you being there. But Rachel, listen to me. He's fast and he's practiced this. By the time you or the referee sees what he's doing, it'll already be happening. So I can't count on you to save me. I can only count on you to make sure the truth is protected after. The saving I have to do myself, in the moment, in real time." She looked her mentor in the eyes. "So trust me to do what my father trained me to do. Stay calm, stay 1 step ahead, and don't lose control no matter what he does." Rachel wanted to argue. She wanted to grab Emily by the shoulders and drag her out of that building and put a continent between her and Mason Caldwell. But she had trained enough warriors to know the look in Emily's eyes, and she knew that this fight was going to happen. And the only thing she could do now was be there when it did. "Your father," Rachel said, her voice thick, "he'd be losing his mind right now if he could see this." Emily smiled, a small, sad, real smile. "No," she said, "he wouldn't. He'd be calm. That's the whole point, Rachel. That's the entire thing he taught me. Everyone else is going to lose their mind out there. The crowd, Mason, maybe even you. And the one person who stays calm is the one who decides how it ends." She took a slow breath. "So I'm going to be calm. For him. One more time." Meanwhile, in another part of the building, Mason Caldwell was preparing in a very different way. He wrapped his hands slowly, methodically, and he did not speak to anyone. The 2 instructors he had spoken with earlier hovered nearby, and they were nervous now because in the daylight, sober away from the heat of the moment, what Mason had said at lunch was starting to sound less like tough talk and more like a confession of something they wanted no part of. "Mason," one of them said quietly, "about what you said earlier, you were just talking, right? blowing off steam. You're not actually gonna. Mason looked at him and his eyes were flat and cold. I'm going to win, he said, however I have to. The two instructors exchanged a look, and something passed between them, and one of them made a decision that Mason did not notice. He slipped out of the room, and he did not go far. He went and found a place near the command staff, and he stood there uncertain, wrestling with his conscience, a man who had heard something he could not unhear and was trying to decide whether he had the courage to do anything about it. 51 minutes past noon, and the number of people who knew what Mason was planning had grown to 4. And Mason alone in his preparation room believed his secret was still his own. He believed he was the smartest, strongest, most dangerous person in the building. He had no idea that the ground had already shifted beneath him, that the woman he intended to cripple knew his plan in intimate detail, that a young private had betrayed him out of conscience, that his own friend was standing outside the command office right now with the truth burning a hole in his chest. Mason believed he was the hunter. He had no idea he had become the hunted. The afternoon wore on toward the final. The undercard matches finished one by one, and with each one the tension in the hangar wound tighter. Soldiers who had gone back to their duties came drifting back to the facility, unable to stay away. Word had spread across the entire base now, and it had spread beyond the base because someone had leaked to the local press that a female Navy SEAL had made the final of the toughest combat competition in the region. And now there were cameras, not many, but enough. Enough that whatever happened in that ring was going to be seen by people far beyond Fort Liberty. Emily sat alone in this quiet room in the last hour before the final, and she did what she always did. She let everything go. She did not think about Mason's plan. She did not think about the cameras, or the crowd, or the risk. She thought about her father. She let herself remember his voice, his hands, the way he had looked at her across the kitchen table when she was 14, with a split lip and a suspension and a heart full of anger. She let herself feel him, close the way she always did before something hard. And she made him a quiet promise, the same promise she made every time. I'll stay in control. Whatever happens, I'll be the one who stays calm. And somewhere in the stillness of that room, she felt something like peace settle over her. Not confidence exactly, not certainty, something deeper than either. The peace of a person who knows exactly who they are and knows that no one, not Mason Caldwell, not 500 soldiers, not the whole watching world can take that away. Then there was a knock and a soldier put his head in, and he said the words the entire base had been waiting for since the moment that competitor list went up on the board. Lieutenant Carter, they're ready for the final. Emily stood. She rolled her shoulders once. She flexed her wrapped hands, and she walked toward the door, calm as still water, toward the man who had sworn to break her. Carrying nothing with her but her training, her discipline, and the voice of her father telling her the truth that had shaped her entire life. The strongest person is never the one who hits the hardest. It's the one who knows exactly who they are. And as she stepped out of that room and into the roar of 500 waiting soldiers, Mason Caldwell was stepping out of his own room on the far side of the hangar, cracking his neck, flexing his split and bandaged knuckles, and telling himself the lie he had told himself his entire life, that he was about to prove one more time that the strongest man always wins. Neither of them had reached the ring yet, but the entire hangar had gone silent as they walked toward it from opposite ends, and every single soldier in that building understood that they were not about to watch a competition. They were about to watch a reckoning. And only 2 people in the entire building knew that the frightened, dangerous man walking to the center of that ring had already lost the one advantage he thought he had, and was about to find out in front of everyone he had ever tried to intimidate. Exactly what happens when arrogance walks into a trap it built for someone else. They reached the ring from opposite ends at the same moment, and the referee, a grizzled master sergeant named Holt, who had officiated these matches for 15 years, motioned them both to the center. Mason stepped up close, closer than the rules required, using every inch of his height, and he looked down at Emily with that cold smile he had worn since the first day. Last chance, he said low just for her. Walk away and I'll tell everybody you had a hamstring pull. You keep your record, you keep your legs. You get in this ring with me and you don't get to keep both. And here was the first moment of the final, the moment Mason had been counting on to break her nerve. He had used it 100 times. The quiet threat at the center of the ring delivered where no one else could hear, designed to plant fear in the last few seconds before the whistle. It had always worked. Men had gone rigid. Men had lost the fight before it started. Emily did not go rigid. She looked up at him calm as still water, and she said something that made the color drain from Mason Caldwell's face. "There's a way to torque a leg," she said quietly, "so it looks like the other person caused their own injury by fighting the hold wrong. That's the move, isn't it, Mason? By the time anybody figures it out, it's over, and the footage backs you up." She let it land. She watched his eyes. "I know exactly what you're going to try. I've known since lunch. So go ahead, reach for it. I'll be waiting." For a full second, Mason Caldwell could not move. His mouth opened slightly. The smile was gone. And in his eyes, for the first time in the entire competition, Emily saw pure, undiluted fear. Because a man who has built his whole life on secret cruelty has just been told calmly to his face that his secret is not a secret at all. "Fight!" Holt barked and stepped back. And Mason, rattled, humiliated, exposed, did the only thing he knew how to do. He attacked. He came at her with everything, all his shenan, all his fury, a storm of aggression designed to overwhelm her in the first 10 seconds before she could think. But Emily had spent a day and a half watching every second of footage of Mason Caldwell, and she knew his opening the way she knew her own heartbeat. She was not there when his first strike arrived. She was already gone, sliding off his line, and Mason's momentum carried him past her into empty space. The crowd made a sound, a collective gasp, because they had all expected the same thing Mason expected, that his opening flurry would be the end of it. Instead, the strongest man on the base had just thrown his best shot at empty air. He turned and came again, and again Emily was not there. 90 seconds in, and Mason Caldwell had not landed a single meaningful strike, and the hangar had gone dead silent, and every soldier in the building was leaning forward because they were watching something none of them had ever seen. They were watching Mason Caldwell chase someone. Mason's frustration built with every miss, and frustration was exactly what Emily wanted. Because a frustrated fighter is a predictable fighter, and a predictable fighter is a fighter who has already lost. Her father's voice was in her ears. The stronger he gets, the more mistakes he'll make. The more emotional he gets, the more you'll be able to read him. Let him wear himself out on the person he thinks you are. Mason threw a heavy overhand right, the kind of punch that had ended matches for 20 years, and Emily slipped it by an inch, and as it sailed past, she tapped him lightly on the shoulder, almost gently, a message. I could have countered there. I chose not to. And Mason understood the message, and it enraged him because there is nothing more humiliating to a man like Mason Caldwell than an opponent who is not just beating him, but is choosing not to hurt him. "Stop running," he snarled, breathing hard already. "Fight me." "I am fighting you," Emily said calmly, circling. "You just don't like how it feels to lose." 2 minutes in, and Rachel Morgan stood at the edge of the platform with Tyler Brooks beside her, and her hand pressed against the folded statement inside her jacket, and she watched Mason's chest heaving, watched the sweat already pouring off him, and she understood what Emily was doing. She's not just winning, Rachel thought. She's draining him. She's making him spend everything before she ever engages. Because a tired man can't torque at a leg with precision. A tired man's trap falls apart. Emily was not just defending. She was managing him. Every exchange cost Mason energy and cost Emily almost none. She let him chase, let him swing, let him wear the smooth, hard edge off his aggression, and with every passing minute, the balance of the fight tilted further toward her without a single decisive blow being struck. And then Mason changed his approach, and this was the moment Emily had been waiting for, because a frustrated fighter eventually stops trying to strike and starts trying to grab. If he could not hit her, he would take her to the ground where his plan lived, where the leg was. Emily saw the shift in his weight, saw him lower his level, saw him commit to the takedown, and a strange calm settled over her because she knew that Mason believed he was finally getting what he wanted. He shot in for the takedown, and Emily let him. The crowd roared because it looked for 1 second like Mason had finally caught her, like his superior weight and strength were finally about to matter. He drove her backward, wrapped her, and took her down to the mat, and the entire hangar came to its feet, because this was where everyone had assumed the fight would be decided all along. On the ground, where the big man wins. Rachel's heart stopped. This is it, she thought. This is where he reaches for it. And Mason did reach for it. Down on the mat in the tangle of the grapple, hidden from the referee's angle, exactly the way he had planned, Mason went for the leg. He shifted his grip, positioned his body, and began the torque, the cruel practice motion designed to look like Emily's own fault, the move that had ended careers before, and that he was certain would end hers. But Emily was already gone. Because she had known. She had known since lunch. And in the half second before Mason could finish the motion, she did the one thing he had not accounted for. The one thing no one who had felt that hold had ever done because they had never known it was coming. Instead of fighting the torque, which was what made it look like the victim's fault, Emily rolled into it faster than Mason had planned, for taking the pressure off her own leg and transferring all of it, all of Mason's own committed force back into his position. His grip designed to trap a resisting opponent found nothing to trap. And the momentum he had put into the move, the momentum meant to snap her leg had nowhere to go but back into his own overextended body. 3 minutes and 40 seconds in, and everything Mason Caldwell had built his entire life on came apart in a single instant. Emily flowed out of the position, reversed it, and rose. And Mason, who had put everything into a move that was supposed to be finished by now, found himself sprawled on the mat, tangled in his own failed cruelty, staring up at a woman who had not only survived his secret weapon, but had seen it coming from the moment they touched hands. The hangar exploded, not in cheering, in noise. Confused, electric, astonished noise because half the crowd did not understand what they had just seen, and the other half understood it perfectly. Rachel Morgan was gripping Tyler's arm so hard, the young private winced, and she was saying over and over under her breath, she saw it. She saw it. She let him try it, and she saw it. Mason scrambled to his feet, and now something had broken loose in him. Exactly the thing Rachel had warned about, exactly the thing she had seen twice before. The plan had failed. The secret was exposed. The crowd was watching him lose. And Mason Caldwell, faced with the total collapse of everything he believed about himself, stopped being a fighter and became something uglier. He stopped caring about the match. He stopped caring about the rules. He stopped caring about anything except the unbearable fact that he was losing in front of everyone to the woman he had promised to break. "Come on!" he screamed, and there was something wild in his voice now, something unhinged. He charged. And here is where the fight became truly dangerous, because a skilled fighter who has abandoned all control is more dangerous than any disciplined one, not because he is more effective, but because he no longer has any limit. Mason threw technique out the window. He threw the rules out the window. He came at Emily with the sole intention of hurting her by any means available, and Master Sergeant Holt, seeing it, moved a step between them, shouting for the break. But Mason did not stop for the referee. He shoved Holt aside, a violation that would have disqualified any fighter in any competition in the world, and he lunged at Emily with a strike that had no purpose except injury, a reckless, illegal, wide-open attack that carried all of his weight and all of his ruined pride behind it. 4 minutes and 10 seconds in, and Emily Carter faced the single most important instant of the entire competition, the moment her father had spent her whole childhood preparing her for without either of them knowing it. A dangerous man had lost control completely. He was committing everything to a strike meant to end her. And in that fraction of a second, Emily had a choice. She could meet his fury with fury. She could answer his loss of control with her own. She could hurt him back as badly as he intended to hurt her. Or she could do what her father taught her: stay calm, stay in control, let him lose his, and use it. Time seemed to slow the way it does in the moments that decide everything. Emily saw Mason's committed weight. She saw the recklessness of the strike, the total abandonment of balance and position. And she understood in that suspended instant that Mason had made himself completely vulnerable in his rage. All of his force was going in one direction, with nothing held in reserve, nothing protecting him, everything committed to the single goal of hurting her. And so Emily did not meet his force, she redirected it. She stepped forward into the attack rather than away from it, closing the distance in the one direction Mason had not defended, and she caught the momentum of his reckless strike and turned it, adding the smallest guiding pressure at exactly the right point, the way water guides a falling stone. She did not throw Mason. She let Mason throw himself. All the force he had committed to breaking her, all the weight and fury and abandoned control, had nowhere to go but where she directed it, which was down hard at an angle his own overextended body could not survive. Mason Caldwell left his feet. For a fraction of a second, the strongest man at Fort Liberty was airborne, carried entirely by the force of his own uncontrolled attack. And there was nothing he could do because the momentum was his, all of it, and Emily had simply given it a direction. And in that frozen instant, some part of Mason understood what was happening, understood that he had done this to himself, that his own loss of control was about to become the thing that destroyed him. He came down. The sound that filled the hangar was one that every soldier in that building would remember for the rest of their lives. It was the sound of a bone breaking. Mason's leg, the full weight of his airborne body driving down on it at exactly the wrong angle, the angle his own reckless momentum had created, snapped with a crack that cut through all the noise of the crowd and silenced it instantly. And then Mason Caldwell was on the mat, and he was screaming, and the entire hangar had gone utterly, completely silent, except for the sound of the strongest man on the base crying out in pain from an injury he had inflicted on himself in the act of trying to cripple someone else. 4 minutes and 20 seconds. That was how long the final match of the Elite Combat Readiness Challenge had lasted. And it was over. But Emily Carter did not celebrate. This was the thing that no one in the hangar was prepared for. The thing that would stay with every soldier who witnessed it longer than the break itself. Emily did not raise her arms. She did not stand over her fallen enemy. She did not look at the crowd for their roar of approval. She stood there, breathing hard, looking down at Mason Caldwell, writhing on the mat, and her face held no triumph at all. It held something no one expected. It held sadness. She had won. She had done the impossible. She had defeated the legend, exposed his cruelty, and survived his worst intention all in front of 500 witnesses. And she looked in that moment of total victory more disappointed than any person in the building. The medical teams rushed onto the platform. Master Sergeant Holt was shouting for them, waving them forward, and the crowd began to make noise again, a rising tide of astonishment and disbelief. But Emily backed away from Mason, slowly giving the medics room, and she did not take her eyes off him, and there was something in the way she looked at him that was almost like grief, because Emily understood something that no one else in that hangar understood yet. She understood that Mason Caldwell had not been beaten by her. He had been beaten by himself, by his own fear, his own arrogance, his own inability to accept a truth that anyone else could have accepted. She had not broken his leg. His refusal to lose with grace had broken his leg. She had simply refused to let his cruelty land on her, and it had rebounded onto him exactly as such things always do. Rachel Morgan was on the platform now, and she reached Emily and gripped her by both shoulders and looked her over, searching for injury and finding none. She pulled her into a fierce embrace. "You're all right," Rachel breathed. "You're all right," I saw it, Emily. "I saw him reach for it, and I saw you roll, and I couldn't. I didn't even have time to move. You were already out of it." She pulled back and looked at her. How did you get out of it that fast?" "Because I knew it was coming," Emily said quietly, and her eyes were still on Mason. "You can't be surprised by a trap you already know about. Tyler saved my leg, Rachel. Tyler heard him planning it, and Tyler came and told me, and that's the only reason I'm standing here right now, instead of being carried off on a stretcher next to him." Rachel turned and found Tyler Brooks in the crowd, the young private who 2 days ago had laughed at Emily and today had betrayed his own hero to protect her. And she pulled the folded statement from inside her jacket and held it up so he could see that she still had it, that the truth was safe, that what he had done had mattered. Tyler could not speak. He was staring at the platform at Mason on the mat, at Emily standing over him, refusing to celebrate, and something in the young man's understanding of the world was rearranging itself in real time. He had spent his whole young life believing that strength meant being the biggest, the loudest, the most feared. And he had just watched the biggest, loudest, most feared man on the base destroy himself with his own rage, while the person he had underestimated stood calm and untouched and refused to gloat. "I thought strength looked like him," Tyler said to no one, to himself, his voice breaking. "I thought it looked like being the scariest person in the room." He shook his head slowly, tears standing in his eyes. "I was so wrong. Strength is her. Strength is staying in control when everyone else loses it. That's it. That's the whole thing. And I almost never learned it." On the mat, the medics were stabilizing Mason's leg, and Mason had stopped screaming and had gone quiet, and in his quiet was something worse than the screaming. Because as the initial shock of the pain faded, a different pain was arriving, one that no medic could treat. Mason Caldwell, lying broken on the platform, where he had reigned undefeated for 20 years, was beginning to understand what had actually happened to him. He had not been outmuscled. He had not been outlucked. He had been outthought, outdisciplined, and outcontrolled by a person he had refused to even see as a threat. And worse, far worse, he had done this to himself. His injury was not her doing. It was his. He had reached for cruelty, and cruelty had come home to him. As they lifted him onto the stretcher, Mason's eyes found Emily's across the platform, and for the first time in the entire competition, he did not look at her with contempt or with fury. He looked at her with the wide, stunned eyes of a man who has just watched his entire understanding of himself collapse. And Emily looked back at him, and she did not look away, and she did not gloat, and she did not offer him the small mercy of pretending it had been an accident of luck. She simply held his gaze steady and calm and sad, and let him sit with the truth. Then they carried him out, and the hangar erupted into a noise unlike anything the Elite Combat Readiness Challenge had ever produced, and Emily Carter, the champion, the woman nobody had expected, stood alone in the center of the platform and did not lift her arms in victory because she had never been fighting for victory in the first place. But the noise, the astonishment, the cameras, none of it was the real story of what happened that day, because within the hour, a very different kind of storm would begin. Because Mason Caldwell had gone into that ring intending to injure someone and had come out injured himself, and there were witnesses to his intent, and there was footage of him shoving the referee, and there were two instructors who had heard him plan the whole thing at lunch, and one of them had already gone to the command staff. And when a man with a 20-year record and powerful friends is carried off a mat with a broken leg, he gave himself while trying to cripple a decorated Navy SEAL in front of 500 witnesses and a handful of cameras. The questions do not end when the medics arrive. They are only beginning. And Master Sergeant Holt, standing at the center of the platform with his whistle still in his hand and his mind still reeling from what he had just refereed, looked down at the dent Mason had left in the mat and the blood on his own arm where Mason had shoved him aside, and he understood with the sinking certainty of a man who has seen how these things go that the fight everyone had come to watch was over. But the real fight, the fight over what it all meant and who would be held to account, had not even started yet. The investigation began before Mason Caldwell had even reached the base hospital. Within 20 minutes of the medics carrying him off the platform, the base commander himself, a full colonel named Whitaker, who had built his career on order and discipline and did not tolerate surprises, had summoned Master Sergeant Holt, Commander Rachel Morgan, and Lieutenant Emily Carter to his office. And the reason he moved so fast was simple. There were cameras. Somebody had leaked the story to the local press, and now there was footage circulating of a decorated female Navy SEAL breaking the leg of the base's most legendary combat instructor, and a colonel who wakes up to that kind of story does not wait. He gets ahead of it, or it gets ahead of him. Emily sat in the colonel's office, still in her competition gear, her hands still wrapped, and across from her, Colonel Whitaker studied her with the flat, unreadable expression of a man who had already decided this was going to be a problem, no matter which way it broke. "Lieutenant Carter," he said, "you understand the position I'm in. One of my most respected instructors is in surgery right now with a compound fracture. There are reporters at my gate, and the footage that's going around shows you putting him there." He folded his hands. "So I'm going to ask you directly, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Did you intend to injure Sergeant Caldwell?" And here was the first moment of the reckoning, the moment where everything Emily had done could have been turned against her, where a calm, honest answer could have been twisted into an admission, where the woman who had done nothing but defend herself could have been made the villain of her own story. Emily felt the weight of it. She understood exactly how these things went. She understood that the easiest thing in the world for the command staff to do would be to protect their legend and sacrifice the outsider. But Emily did not flinch. She looked Colonel Whitaker in the eye, and she answered with the same calm she had carried into the ring. "No, sir," she said. "I did not intend to injure him. I intended to survive him." Whitaker's eyebrow moved a fraction. "Explain that." "Sergeant Caldwell told me at the center of the ring, seconds before the whistle, that if I fought him, I would not keep both my record and my legs." Emily's voice did not waver. "He had a plan to injure me, sir, a specific one. A way of torquing a leg during a ground exchange so that it looks like the injured person caused it themselves by resisting. Wrong. He'd used it before. When he took me to the ground, he reached for exactly that. And I didn't fight it the way he expected because I knew it was coming. I rolled with it instead of against it, and his own force went back into him. Then he lost control, shoved the referee, and committed everything to an illegal strike. I redirected it. His momentum did the rest. I never generated the force that broke his leg, sir. He did. I just refused to let it land on me. The office was very quiet. That's a detailed account, Whitaker said slowly, of a plan you claim to have known about in advance. How exactly did you know, Lieutenant? And this was the moment Emily had been waiting for, the reason she had insisted back in that quiet room before the match that Tyler write everything down. Because someone came forward, sir, Emily said, before the match at great personal cost. And Commander Morgan has his statement written and dated before the final ever began. Every eye in the room turned to Rachel Morgan, and Rachel, without a word, reached into her jacket and pulled out the folded paper she had guarded against her chest through the entire fight, and she stood and she placed it on the colonel's desk. Private Tyler Brooks wrote this an hour before the final, sir, Rachel said. He overheard Sergeant Caldwell describing his plan to two other instructors. He came to Lieutenant Carter's room terrified, and he told her everything because he could not stand by and let it happen. And I made him write it down before the match so that no one could later claim we invented it after the fact. She tapped the paper. The timestamp is on it, Colonel. This was in my jacket before the first whistle. It predicts in detail exactly the move Sergeant Caldwell attempted, a move that is on the footage if you know where to look for it now. 28 minutes into the investigation, and the entire shape of it had just changed, because a colonel looking at a leaked video of a woman injuring a legend is a colonel with a public relations problem and an easy villain. But a colonel holding a signed timestamp statement that predicts the legend's illegal plan before it happened, it is a colonel with something else entirely. He is a colonel holding evidence that his legend is the one who should be afraid. Whitaker read the statement twice. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did. He set the paper down carefully. Master Sergeant Holt, he said, you refereed the match. In your professional judgment with 15 years of officiating, what did you see? Holt had been standing rigid the whole time, and now he shifted, and there was something troubled in his weathered face, the look of a man who had seen something he could not explain away. Sir, he said, I've reffed these matches a long time. I know what a clean fall looks like, and I know what a dirty one looks like. He paused. Sergeant Caldwell went to the ground looking for something. I couldn't see what from my angle, and now I understand why. He'd positioned himself to hide it from me. That was deliberate, and when it didn't work, he came apart. He shoved me, sir, put his hands on the referee, and shoved me out of the way to get at her. In 15 years, I have never had a fighter do that. That alone is a disqualification and a discharge-level offense. He swallowed. And the strike he threw after the one that put him in the air, that wasn't a technique. That was a man trying to hurt somebody. Lieutenant Carter didn't throw him, sir. He threw himself, and she just wasn't standing where he needed her to be. I'd stake my career on it. 35 minutes in, and the two most authoritative voice in the room, the referee and the mentor, had both told the same story, and it was not the story the leaked footage seemed to tell. It was the opposite. But Colonel Whitaker had not built a career by acting on the first version of events he was handed, and he did the thing that would ultimately decide everything. He called for the footage, all of it. Not the clip that had leaked the one shot from a single dramatic angle, but every camera in that hangar, and there had been many, because a competition of that size was recorded from every corner for training and review. We're going to watch all of it, Whitaker said. Every angle, frame by frame if we have to. Because if what the three of you are telling me is true, then I don't have a problem with Lieutenant Carter. I have a very different problem with a man I've trusted for a very long time, and I need to be certain. They watched. They watched for over an hour, and the room was silent except for the colonel occasionally asking for a segment to be replayed. And angle by angle, the truth assembled itself in front of them, undeniable, mechanical, incapable of lying. There was Mason at the center of the ring, leaning in, saying something to Emily that no one could hear, but that made her go very still. There was the opening flurry, all of it missing. There was the takedown, and then from a camera positioned high on the far wall, a camera Mason could not have accounted for. There was the clear and unmistakable image of his hands moving to Emily's leg, positioning for the torque exactly as Tyler's statement had described it an hour before it happened. There was Emily rolling with it, the force rebounding. There was Mason scrambling up, wild-eyed. There was Mason shoving Holt aside with both hands, a clear and shocking violation. And there was the final reckless lunge, Mason committing all his weight to a strike that had no defensive purpose, and Emily stepping in and redirecting it in Mason's own airborne momentum, bringing him down onto his own leg. 51 minutes into the footage, Colonel Whitaker leaned back in his chair, and he was quiet for a long time. "Play the leg again," he said finally. "The high camera." They played it, and in that footage from that angle, there was no ambiguity left. Mason Caldwell had reached for a cruel and hidden technique designed to injure, and it had failed because his opponent had known it was coming, and then his own loss of control had done to him precisely what he had intended to do to her. Whitaker turned to Emily, and when he spoke, his voice had changed. The suspicion was gone from it. "Lieutenant Carter," he said, "I owe you a more careful hearing than I gave you when you walked in. I brought you into this room half ready to believe you were the problem. I was wrong." He looked at the paused image on the screen, at his legend, frozen in the act of reaching for the leg. That footage doesn't show a woman who injured a man. It shows a man who tried to cripple a soldier under the cover of a sanctioned match and injured himself doing it. You are cleared of any wrongdoing, completely. And I want that on the record in writing today before another hour goes by. Emily let out a slow breath, but she did not smile, and Whitaker noticed. "You don't look relieved, Lieutenant," he said. "I'm relieved the truth held, sir," Emily said quietly. "I'm not happy about any of it. A man is in surgery. Young soldiers watch something today they can't unsee. And a private betrayed a man he idolized because it was the right thing, and now he's going to have to live on this base with people who will call him a snitch for it." She looked at the colonel steadily. "There's no version of today I get to celebrate, sir. I just didn't get destroyed. That's not the same thing as winning." 1 hour and 10 minutes into the reckoning, and Colonel Whitaker, a hard man who had seen a great many soldiers pass through his command, looked at Lieutenant Emily Carter with something that had not been in his eyes when she walked in. It was respect. The kind of respect that cannot be commanded or demanded, the kind that is only ever earned and only ever given reluctantly by men like Whitaker, who give it to almost no one. "Private Brooks," Whitaker said, "the one who came forward. I want to see him." They brought Tyler Brooks to the office, and the young private stood in the doorway looking like he might be sick, because a 19-year-old summoned to the base commander's office does not assume good things are coming. He came to attention so rigidly he was almost trembling. "Private Brooks," Whitaker said, "you wrote this statement an hour before the final." "Yes, sir," Tyler managed. "You informed on a superior, a man you respected. You put your own standing on this base at risk to protect a soldier you'd known for 2 days. Whitaker studied him. "Why?" And Tyler Brooks, standing in the office of the most powerful man on the base, terrified out of his mind, said the thing that Emily had told him his parents would be proud of. "Because it was wrong, sir," he said, his voice shaking but not stopping. "I heard him planning to hurt her on purpose, so he wouldn't have to lose. And I kept thinking, if I don't say anything and he does it, and I could have stopped it, then what am I? What kind of soldier am I? What kind of man?" He swallowed hard. 2 days ago, I laughed when he said she didn't belong here, sir. I laughed. And then I watched her fight, and I watched her pick up every person she beat, and I couldn't be part of hurting somebody like that, even if it cost me. So I told her, and I'd do it again, sir, even knowing what people are going to say about me." The office was silent. Colonel Whitaker stood, and a colonel standing is not a small thing. And he looked at the 19-year-old private, and he said, "Son, in 26 years of service, I have watched a lot of men fail the exact test you just described. They hear something wrong and they decide it's not their business, and they let it happen, and they tell themselves they had no choice. You had every reason to stay quiet and you didn't." He extended his hand. "That's not snitching, Private. That's what integrity actually looks like when it costs you something. Anyone on this base gives you grief for what you did, you send them to me." Tyler shook the colonel's hand in a daze, and when he looked over at Emily, she gave him a small nod. And in that nod was everything the confirmation that he had become in a single act of courage, the kind of man he had spent his whole life wanting to be without knowing how. But the reckoning was not over, because there was still the matter of Mason Caldwell, and there was still the matter of the 2 instructors who had heard him plan the whole thing, and there was still the leaked footage circulating in the world beyond the base, showing only the dramatic clip and none of the truth. And it was that last piece that produced the twist no one in the office saw coming. Because as they were finishing, a staff sergeant knocked and entered with a laptop and an expression of alarm, and he said, "Colonel, you need to see this, the clip that leaked. It's blowing up, but sir, it's not going the way you'd think. He turned the laptop around, and the reckoning took its strangest turn yet. Because the clip that had leaked the single dramatic angle showing Emily bringing Mason down had been posted with a caption meant to make Emily the villain, meant to show a woman brutally injuring a beloved veteran instructor. Whoever leaked it, and they would later learn it was one of Mason's two instructor friends trying to get ahead of the story and protect him, had intended to turn public opinion against her. It had backfired completely. Because the public did not see a villain. They saw a smaller person calmly redirecting a much larger, obviously enraged man who was visibly out of control. They saw the shove of the referee clear even in that clip. And veterans, real ones, combat veterans, who understood what they were looking at, had begun flooding the comments, and they were not condemning Emily. They were defending her. Old SEALs, old Rangers, old Marines, people who knew exactly what a reckless, committed attack looked like, and exactly what it meant to redirect one, were explaining to the public comment by comment that the woman in the video had not attacked anyone. She had survived someone. And the more the original poster tried to spin it, the more the veterans corrected the record until the entire narrative had inverted and Emily Carter had become, without seeking it, without wanting it, a symbol. She never even looks angry. Whitaker read aloud from one of the comments, a comment from a retired Master Chief with 40 years of service. Watch her face. Every soldier should study this. That is what discipline under pressure looks like. That is the whole job. 1 hour and 40 minutes into the reckoning, and the trap that Mason's own ally had set to destroy Emily Carter had done to them exactly what Mason's cruelty had done to Mason. It had rebounded. The lie had been swallowed by the truth because there were too many people who knew how to read what they were seeing, and the truth, once enough people can see, it does not lose. Emily watched the screen and she did not look pleased, and Rachel standing beside her understood why. You didn't want any of this, Rachel said quietly. No, Emily said. I wanted to fight my match and go back to work. She shook her head slowly. I don't want to be a symbol, Rachel. Symbols aren't people. The second you become a symbol, everybody stops seeing you and starts seeing what they need you to be. I've spent my whole career trying to just be a soldier who does the job, and now I'm a video. Maybe, Rachel says gently, but look at what they're learning from the video. Look at what that Master Chief wrote. They're not learning that a woman beat a man. They're learning what your father taught you. Stay in control when everyone else loses it. That's the lesson going out to millions of people right now, Emily. Whether you wanted to teach it or not, that's the lesson. She put a hand on Emily's shoulder. Your father spent his whole life teaching that to one person, you. And now, because of one terrible afternoon, it's going out to the whole world in your voice. I don't think he'd be upset about that. I think he'd be proud. Emily was quiet for a long moment, watching the comments scroll, watching old warriors she had never met defend a truth about her that she had never spoken aloud, and something in her expression softened just slightly. Maybe, she said. The final piece of the reckoning came late that evening, and it came in the form of the two instructors who had heard Mason plan the whole thing at lunch. One of them, the one who had leaked the footage, tried at first to protect himself, tried to claim he had heard nothing, tried to say Mason had only been talking. But the other one, the one who had slipped out during Mason's preparation and stood outside the command office wrestling with his conscience, had finally found his courage. And when Colonel Whitaker called them both in, that second instructor told the truth. He told us his plan, Sir Edouard, the man said, his voice heavy with the weight of what he was doing. At lunch, he described the leg technique. He said he'd rather end her career than lose his reputation. And I sat there and I didn't say anything because he's Mason Caldwell, and you don't cross Mason Caldwell. He looked down, but a 19-year-old private did what I didn't have the guts to do. A kid I outranked by 10 years showed more spine than I did, and I've been sick about it all day. He met the colonel's eyes. I should have come forward before the match, sir. I'll accept whatever comes to me for waiting. But I'm not going to let him lie about it now. It happened exactly the way the private said. 2 hours into the reckoning, and the last wall protecting Mason Caldwell had come down. Not because of Emily, not because of the footage, but because his own cruelty had cost him the loyalty he had spent 20 years demanding through fear. Because fear buys silence, but it does not buy loyalty. And when a frightened man finally falls, the people he intimidated do not catch him. They step back and let him hit the ground. And that was the deepest truth of the entire reckoning, the truth that Emily had understood from the very beginning and that everyone else was only now catching up to. Mason Caldwell had not been destroyed by Emily Carter. He had been destroyed by the way he had chosen to live. He had built his whole life on dominance and fear, and in the moment he needed people to stand by him, there was no one because he had never given anyone a reason to. The private he had never bothered to know had betrayed him out of conscience. The instructor he had counted on had told the truth out of shame. The commander who had trusted him for years had turned on the evidence without hesitation. And the woman he had promised to break had refused to hate him even as he tried to cripple her. Colonel Whitaker closed the last folder on his desk. It was late now and the office was quiet, and the storm that had begun the moment Mason hit the mat had finally mostly blown itself out. He looked at Emily one last time. "There'll be a formal proceeding for Sergeant Caldwell," he said. "Conduct unbecoming. Assault on a referee. What he planned and attempted on the record with witnesses. His career here is finished, and it finished by his own hand." He paused. "I'll be honest with you, Lieutenant. I'm not going to enjoy any part of it. That man served this country for a long time, and there was a version of him a long time ago that was worth something. Somewhere along the way, he decided that being feared was the same as being strong, and it cost him everything." He looked at her. "You knew that about him before any of us did, before he even got in the ring with you. How?" And Emily Carter cleared. Vindicated, exhausted, gave the colonel the answer that was the entire heart of everything, the answer her father had given her at a kitchen table when she was 14 years old, with a split lip and a lifetime still ahead of her. "Because my father taught me the difference, sir," she said quietly. "The strongest person in the room is never the one who hits the hardest. It's the one who knows exactly who they are, even when the whole world is screaming at them to be something else." Mason spent 20 years hitting the hardest. He never once figured out who he was underneath it, and a man who doesn't know who he is will always eventually come apart. "I didn't beat him, sir. I just stayed standing while he found that out about himself." The office was silent for a long moment. Then Colonel Whitaker nodded slowly, and he said the last word of the reckoning, and it was the highest thing a man like him ever said to anyone. "Dismiss Lieutenant Carter," he said, "and well done." Emily walked out of that office into the cool night air, and Rachel walked beside her. And Tyler Brooks was waiting outside, and the three of them stood together for a moment under the lights of a base that would never quite talk about anything the same way again. The reckoning was over. The truth had held. Emily had been cleared, Tyler had been honored, and Mason Caldwell was facing the collapse of everything he had built by his own hand, exactly as such things always end. But Emily Carter did not feel like a champion, and she did not feel like a symbol, and she did not feel like the woman in the video that millions of strangers were now sharing across the world. She felt like a soldier who had done a hard thing and survived it and would have given a great deal to have never had to do it at all. And she looked up at the night sky over Fort Liberty, and she thought of her father, and she said to him silently the only thing there was left to say. "I stayed in control, even then, even when he made it as hard as he could. I stayed calm the way you taught me. And it held, Dad. It held." The weeks that followed did not unfold the way anyone at Fort Liberty expected, least of all Emily Carter. She had assumed once the investigation cleared her and the formal proceedings against Mason began, that things would quiet down and she could return to being what she had always wanted to be, a soldier who did her job and drew no attention to herself. But the video did not quiet down. It grew. Within a week, it had been viewed millions of times, and within 2 weeks, it had crossed over from military circles into the wider world. And everywhere it went, it carried the same lesson that retired Master Chief had written in that first comment. Watch her face. That is what discipline under pressure looks like. And the requests began to arrive. Interview requests, television requests, a publisher who wanted a book, a production company that wanted the rights to her story, a senator's office that wanted her to appear at an event. And Emily turned down every single one of them. Rachel Morgan found her in the training facility one evening alone, working through a drill she had done 10,000 times, and she leaned against the wall and watched for a while before she spoke. "You know, a network offered you a primetime sit-down," Rachel said. "You could tell your whole story, your father, the training, all of it. Millions of people would hear it." "I know," Emily said, not breaking her rhythm. "You turned it down." "I turned it down." Rachel was quiet for a moment. Emily, half the young women in this country would give anything for the platform you're being handed. You could be an inspiration to a whole generation. Why walk away from that? Emily finished her drill and turned to face her mentor, and she wiped the sweat from her face and she answered honestly. Because the second I sit in that chair, I stop being a soldier and I become a story. And stories get shaped, Rachel. They get edited. They get turned into whatever the person holding the camera needs them to be. I've watched it happen to people. They start out wanting to say something true, and by the time it airs, they're a character in somebody else's script. She shook her head. I don't want to be a character. I did my job. That's the whole thing. The moment I start selling it, it stops being the thing that was worth doing. So you're just going to let it fade, Rachel said. Let the video go viral and then and go back to duty like none of it happened. That's exactly what I'm going to do, Emily said. And then something in her face softened and she added quietly, the lesson's already out there, Rachel. It doesn't need me sitting in a studio to keep teaching it. My father never once went on television. He taught one person at a kitchen table, and that was enough to end up changing everything that happened in that ring. That's how the real things travel. Quietly, person to person, not through a spotlight. Rachel looked at her for a long moment, and then she smiled a little sadly. You really are his daughter. I really am, Emily said. But there was one request Emily did not turn down, and it came a month later, and it came from the last person on earth anyone expected. It came from Mason Caldwell. He was still in recovery. The compound fracture had required 2 surgeries and would keep him on crutches for months, and what the doctors said likely end his days as a combat instructor for good. The formal proceedings had run their course, and they had been merciless because the evidence had been merciless. Assault on a referee, a premeditated plan to injure described to witnesses in advance and captured attempting it on camera. Conduct that could not be explained away or excused. Mason Caldwell's 20-year career had ended not with honor, but with a discharge under conditions that stripped away nearly everything he had built. The legend was gone, and the man who was left was something none of the young soldiers who had once idolized him would have recognized. The message came through a chaplain of all people. Mason had asked through the base chaplain whether Emily would be willing to meet with him. Just once, before he left the base for good. Rachel was against it immediately. Absolutely not, she said when Emily told her. That man tried to cripple you, Emily. He spent your whole time here trying to humiliate you, and when that didn't work, he tried to end your career. You owe him nothing, less than nothing. You don't have to give him one more second of your life. You're right, Emily said. I don't. Then don't. Emily was quiet, turning the chaplain's note over in her hands. But I'm going to, she said finally. Rachel stared at her. Why give me one good reason why you would sit across from that man voluntarily? And Emily gave her the reason, and it was the reason that separated her from everyone else. In this entire story, the reason her father had planted in her at a kitchen table 12 years before. Because when I beat him, she said slowly, I didn't do it to humiliate him. I told you that from the beginning. I did it because he made a choice that forced my hand, and I did the least harm I could while protecting myself. And if I refuse to even look at him now, then I'm admitting that some part of me did want to destroy him, that I did want him broken and gone. She looked up at Rachel. And I didn't. I never did. So I'm going to go, and I'm going to sit across from him, not because he's earned it, but because refusing would make me into something I've spent my whole life trying not to become. A person who hates. My father used to say, hate is just fear that got comfortable. I'm not going to let it get comfortable in me. Rachel had no answer for that. She had known Emily for 6 years, and time and again, Emily had shown her a kind of strength that Rachel, for all her decades of service, was still learning to understand. So she said nothing more except, then I'm driving you, and I'm waiting outside. The meeting took place in a small room in the base recovery wing, and when Emily walked in, she almost did not recognize the man waiting for her. Mason Caldwell had lost weight. The mask that had made him so intimidating was gone, melted away by weeks of inactivity and something heavier than inactivity. He sat in a chair with his leg in a brace and crutches propped beside him, and he was smaller than she remembered, not just in body, but in some way that went deeper than body. The arrogance was gone. The cold certainty that had radiated off him from the first day was gone. What was left was a man who looked like he had been hollowed out and had not yet figured out what, if anything, should fill the space. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "Thank you for coming," Mason said finally. His voice was rough. "I didn't think you would." "I almost didn't," Emily said. She sat down across from him. She did not offer false warmth, but she did not offer coldness either. She simply sat calm and present and waited. Mason looked down at his hands, and then he looked up at her, and he said the thing he had asked her here to say, and it clearly cost him more than any physical pain he had endured. "I was wrong about you," he said. Emily said nothing. She waited. "I've had a lot of time to think," Mason went on, the words coming slow and heavy. "That's the thing about lying in a bed for weeks with a leg you broke yourself. You can't run from your own head anymore. And I've been going back over it. All of it. The day the list went up. The things I said, what I planned to do to you." He stopped and his jaw worked, and Emily could see how hard this was for a man who had never in his life admitted to being wrong about anything. "I told myself I was protecting my reputation. That's what I said in my head the whole time. But that wasn't it. I was scared. I watched you fight, and I knew that you were better than me, and I couldn't stand it. 20 years I built myself into the strongest man on this base, and a 26-year-old woman I'd never met exposed me in 2 days. And instead of accepting it, instead of being a man about it, I tried to break your leg so I'd never have to know for sure whether you could beat me." He laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "And I broke my own instead. There's a word for that. I looked it up. Poetic justice. Turns out the universe has a sense of humor." Emily was quiet for a moment, and then she spoke, and her voice was not cruel, but it was honest, because she had never once lied to him, and she was not going to start now. "You didn't break your leg," she said. "Your fear broke your leg. I've been trying to tell you that from the first day, Mason, without ever saying a word of it out loud. You were never fighting me. You were fighting the possibility that you weren't who you told yourself you were. And that's a fight nobody wins. Because the harder you fight to protect a lie about yourself, the more damage you do, until eventually the lie takes everything." She leaned forward slightly. "I saw it in you before you ever got in that ring. You want to know why I stayed so calm? Because I wasn't fighting a strong man. I was fighting a terrified one. And terrified men are the easiest opponents in the world because they beat themselves. I just had to stay out of the way while you did it." Mason absorbed this in silence, and something moved across his face, something that looked almost like grief. "How did you learn to see people like that?" he asked. "That's not a combat skill. They don't teach that anywhere." "My father taught me," Emily said. And for the first time in the conversation, her own composure wavered just slightly, because talking about her father still opened a place in her that had not healed. "He was a SEAL, 22 years, and he came home from all of it, and the thing he cared most about teaching me had nothing to do with fighting. He told me when I was 14 that the strongest person in the room is never the one who hits the hardest. It's the one who knows exactly who they are, even when the whole world is screaming at them to be something else." She paused. "You spent 20 years being the one who hit the hardest, Mason, and you never once found out who you were underneath it. That's the whole tragedy of you. Not that you lost, that you were so busy being feared that you never got around to being known." The room was silent for a long, long moment, and then Mason Caldwell, the legend, the undefeated, the man who had mocked her in front of hundreds of soldiers, put his face in his hands, and his shoulders shook, and this enormous, hollowed-out man wept. Not theatrically, not for sympathy. He wept the way a person weeps when a truth they have avoided their whole life finally arrives and there is nowhere left to hide from it. Emily did not rush to comfort him. She did not tell him it was all right, because it was not all right, and false comfort would have been its own kind of lie. But she did not leave either. She sat with him steady and present, and she let him have the moment, because everyone, even a man who had tried to cripple her, deserved the dignity of finally facing themselves without an audience. When he had gathered himself, Mason wiped his face and looked at her, and he asked the question that had clearly been living in him for weeks. "Why don't you hate me?" he said. "I gave you every reason. I mocked you. I tried to end your career. By every right, you should hate me. Everyone would understand it if you did. So why don't you?" And Emily gave him the answer. That was the deepest thing she believed, the thing that had carried her through SEAL training and classified operations, and the loss of her father in the worst afternoon of her life in that ring. "Because hate would mean you still get to control how I feel," she said simply. And I decided a long time ago that no one gets to do that. Not you, not anyone. The moment I hate you, you win, Mason, because it means you got inside me, you changed who I am, you made me into someone smaller and angrier than I was before I met you. And I'm not going to hand you that. Not after everything. She stood up. I don't hate you. I don't even dislike you. I feel sorry for you. And I hope honestly that the man you become after all, this is better than the one who got in that ring. Because you've got a chance now that you never had before. You've lost everything you built your life on. That's the worst thing that's ever happened to you. And it might turn out to be the best if you let it teach you what it's trying to teach you. Mason looked up at her and there were tears still on his face, and he said in a voice barely above a whisper, I don't know how to be anyone but who I was. Nobody does at first, Emily said gently. That's what starting over means. You'll figure it out the same way everybody does, one honest day at a time. She moved toward the door, and then she stopped, and she turned back, and she gave him one last thing because it was in her nature to give, even when the person had not earned it. For what it's worth, Mason, the fact that you asked me here and said what you said, that took more courage than anything you ever did in that ring. Winning a fight is easy. Admitting you were wrong when you've built your whole life on never being wrong, that's the hard one. You just did the hard one. So maybe you're stronger than you think, just not in the way you always believed. And then she left, and she did not look back, and Mason Caldwell sat alone in that room with the first real chance at becoming a decent human being he had been given in 20 years, and whether he took it or not was at last up to him and no one else. Rachel was waiting outside, leaning against the car, and when Emily came out, she searched her face carefully. Well, she said, was it worth it? Emily was quiet for a moment. He apologized, she said. He meant it. He cried. She looked back at the recovery wing. I don't know if he'll change. Maybe he will, maybe he won't. That's not mine to carry anymore. But I said what I needed to say, and I left there the same person I walked in as. That was the whole point. She got in the car. That's the only thing I was ever protecting, Rachel. Not my record, not my reputation. Just the person I am, and she's intact. They drove back in comfortable silence, two soldiers who understood each other without needing words. But the story of what happened at Fort Liberty did not end in that recovery room, because the ripples of a single afternoon travel far, and they travel into lives you never see. And the deepest ripple of all traveled into the life of a 19-year-old private named Tyler Brooks. Tyler had braced himself after the investigation for the worst. He had betrayed the base's legend. He had informed on a superior, and he had expected when the whole thing became public to be branded a snitch and frozen out to become the man nobody trusted, the private who couldn't keep his mouth shut. He had made his peace with that, more or less, because Emily had told him his parents had raised a good man, and he had decided to try to live up to it no matter what it cost. But that is not what happened, because Colonel Whitaker had meant what he said in that office, and the colonel made sure, quietly and without fanfare, that the truth of what Tyler had done spread through the base as thoroughly as the false version might have. And the soldiers of Fort Liberty, when they understood the whole story, when they understood that a 19-year-old private had risked everything to stop a premeditated assault on a fellow soldier, did not brand him a snitch. They did something Tyler never expected. They started treating him with respect. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind, the kind that soldiers reserve for one of their own, who has proven when it counted that he could be trusted with the thing that matters most, which is the safety of the person next to him. An old sergeant major, a man with 3 decades of service and a chest full of ribbons, stopped Tyler in the mess hall one day in front of everyone and shook his hand and said loud enough for the whole room to hear, "Private Brooks, I heard what you did. In 30 years, I've seen 100 men look the other way when it was inconvenient to do the right thing. You didn't. You remember that feeling, son. That's the feeling of being the kind of soldier other men can count on. Don't ever lose it." And Tyler Brooks, who 2 months earlier had laughed at a woman because a bully told him to stood a little straighter every day after that. He had learned at 19 the lesson that some men serve their whole careers and never learn. He had learned what strength actually was, and he would carry that lesson through the rest of his service, and he would pass it on to the young soldiers who came after him. And in that way, the thing Emily's father had taught at a kitchen table would keep traveling person to person, quietly, the way the real things always travel long after anyone had forgotten the video that started it. As for Emily, she returned to duty exactly as she had said she would. She rejoined her team. She went back to the work she could not talk about, the work that had never once required an audience or a spotlight or a story. And the video faded exactly as she had known it would, replaced by the next thing, and the thing after that, the way everything online eventually fades. Within a few months, most people had forgotten the specifics. But the ones who needed the lesson, the ones it was really for, they did not forget. Somewhere out there, a young woman who had been told she didn't belong watched that video and decided to stay. Somewhere out there, a young man who had been taught that strength meant domination watched it and started to question everything he thought he knew. Somewhere out there, the lesson landed in the quiet way lessons land, in the people who were ready to receive it. Emily never knew about most of them. She never wanted to. She had done the thing that was worth doing, and she had let it go, and she had gone back to work, and that was enough. That had always been enough. There was one more moment, though, one more piece of the story, and it had happened almost a year later on a quiet evening when Emily had gone home on leave to the house where she had grown up, the house with the garden her father had loved, the garden where he had died. She went out to that garden in the evening, the way she always did when she came home, and she sat on the old bench her father had built with his own hands. And she talked to him the way she had talked to him her whole life out loud, sometimes silently others. "A lot happened this year, Dad," she said quietly to the empty garden. "You'd have hated the video part, all that noise. You'd have told me to ignore it and get back to work." She smiled. "So I did. I ignored it and I got back to work. Just like you would have." The wind moved through the garden, and Emily was quiet for a while. "There was a man," she went on, "Mason. He tried to hurt me, tried to end everything, really. And in the moment when he came at me with everything he had, I heard your voice. Clear as anything. Stay calm. Stay in control. Let him lose his and use it." She looked up at the darkening sky. "And I did, Dad. I stayed calm, even when it was as hard as it's ever been. I was the one person in that room who didn't lose control, just like you always told me to be. And it held. Everything you taught me held." Her voice caught just slightly. "I wish you could have seen it, not the fight. You wouldn't have cared about the fight. I wish you could have seen that when it mattered most, when a man was trying to destroy me and the whole world was screaming, I remembered exactly who I was. Because that was your whole life's work, Dad, making sure I'd always remember who I was. And it worked. It worked perfectly. When it counted, I knew." She sat there a long time as the stars came out over the garden, and she felt her father close the way she always did, and she understood something she had not fully understood before. She understood that she had not defeated Mason Caldwell in that ring. Her father had, 12 years earlier at a kitchen table with a lesson about who a person really is. Her father had reached across time and death and stood in that ring with her in every calm breath she took, in every reckless attack she redirected instead of returning. He had never gone to war with Mason Caldwell, but he had won that fight all the same, because the strongest thing he ever built was not his own body or his own record. It was his daughter. And she had carried everything he was into that ring, and she had come out the other side exactly the person he had raised her to be. And that was the truth of the whole story. The truth that traveled out from Fort Liberty into millions of lives, the truth that a bully never understood, and a young private finally learned, and a broken legend was only beginning to grasp. Respect is not given because of size or reputation or the fear you can put into other people. Respect is earned through discipline, through character, through knowing exactly who you are when everything is on the line and the whole world is trying to make you into someone else. The strongest person in any room is never the one who hits the hardest. It is the one who stays in control when everyone else has lost it. It is the one who does not need to break others to feel unbroken themselves. It is the one who knows without a shadow of a doubt exactly who they are. Emily Carter knew. She had always known. She was her father's daughter, a soldier who did her job, a warrior who never fought to prove she was powerful because she had never once needed to. And on the day a man tried to break her in front of 500 soldiers, she did not break, and she did not hate, and she did not lose herself, because the man who raised her had spent his whole life making certain that she never would. She was a Navy SEAL. And no one, not Mason Caldwell, not 500 witnesses, not the whole watching world ever took that from her, because it was never something she had to prove. It was simply and permanently and unbreakably who she was. Weeks passed at Fort Liberty, And the storm that everyone expected to fade did not fade. It grew. Emily Carter had assumed that once the investigation cleared, her and the proceedings against Mason began, the noise would die down and she could go back to being what she had always wanted to be, a soldier who did her job and drew no attention to herself. But the video would not die. Within a week, it had been viewed millions of times. Within 2 weeks, it had crossed out of military circles into the wider world. And everywhere it traveled, it carried the same lesson that retired Master Chief had written in that very first comment. Watch her face. That is what discipline under pressure looks like. Then the requests started arriving and they did not stop. Television networks, a major publisher who wanted a book, a production company that wanted the rights to her life story, a senator's office that wanted her to appear at a veterans event, a morning show that offered to fly her out first class for a single interview. And Emily turned down every single one of them, one after another, without hesitation. Rachel Morgan found her in the training facility one evening alone, running through a drill she had done 10,000 times, and she leaned against the wall and watched for a long while before she spoke. A national network offered you a primetime sit-down, Rachel said. An hour. Your whole story. Your father, the training, and all of it. Millions of people would hear it in your own words. I know, Emily said, not breaking her rhythm. And you told them no. I told them no. Rachel crossed her arms. Emily, half the young women in this country would give anything for the platform you're being handed on a silver plate. You could be an inspiration to an entire generation. Help me understand why you keep walking away from it. Emily finished the drill and turned to face her mentor, wiping the sweat from her forehead, and she answered honestly. Because the second I sit down in that chair, I stop being a soldier and I become a story. And stories get shaped, Rachel. They get edited, they get cut and rearranged until they say whatever the person holding the camera needs them to say. I've watched it happen to good people. They walk in wanting to tell the truth, and by the time it airs, they're a character in somebody else's script. So you'd rather it just vanish? I'd rather it stay true, Emily said. And then something in her face softened. The lesson's already out there. It doesn't need me in a studio to keep teaching it. My father never once went on television in his whole life. He taught one person at a kitchen table, and that was enough to decide what happened in that ring 12 years later. That's how the real things travel, Rachel. Quietly, person to person, not through a spotlight. Rachel looked at her for a long moment, and then she smiled a little sadly. You really are his daughter. I really am, Emily said. But there was one request Emily did not turn down. It came a month later, and it came from the last person on earth anyone expected. It came from Mason Caldwell. He was still in recovery. The compound fracture had required 2 separate surgeries and would keep him on crutches for months, and it would, the doctors said, likely end his days as a combat instructor for good. The formal proceedings had run their course, and they had been merciless because the evidence had been merciless. Assault on a referee captured on camera. A premeditated plan to injure a fellow soldier described to 2 witnesses in advance and captured on film in the act of attempting it. Conduct that could not be excused, minimized, or explained away by anyone, no matter how much they had once admired him. Mason Caldwell's 20-year career had ended not with honor, but with a discharge under conditions that stripped away nearly everything he had spent his life building. The legend was gone, and the man who remained was someone none of the young soldiers who had once worshipped him would have recognized. The message came through the base chaplain of all people. Mason had asked through him whether Emily would be willing to meet with him. Just once, before he left Fort Liberty for good. Rachel was against it the instant she heard. Absolutely not, she said. That man tried to cripple you, Emily. He spent your entire time here trying to humiliate you, and when that failed, he tried to end your career on purpose. You owe him nothing, less than nothing. You do not have to give him one more second of your life. You're right, Emily said quietly. I don't. Then don't. Emily turned the chaplain's folded note over in her hands. But I'm going to. Rachel stared at her. Why give me one good reason why you would voluntarily sit across a table from that man? And Emily gave her the reason, and it was the reason that separated her from every other person in this entire story. Because when I beat him, she said slowly, I didn't do it to humiliate him. I told you that from the very beginning. I did it because he made a choice that forced my hand, and I did the least harm I possibly could while protecting myself. And if I refuse to even look at him now, then some part of me is admitting that I did want him destroyed, that I did want him broken and gone. She looked up, and I didn't. I never did. So I'm going to go, and I'm going to sit across from him. Not because he's earned it, because refusing would turn me into something I've spent my whole life trying not to become. A person who hates. My father used to say, hate is just fear that got comfortable. I'm not going to let it get comfortable in me. Rachel had no answer for that. She had known Emily for 6 years, and time and again, Emily had shown her a kind of strength that Rachel, for all her decades of service, was still learning to understand. So she said nothing more except, "Then I'm driving you, and I'm waiting right outside that door the whole time." The meeting took place in a small room in the base recovery wing, and when Emily walked in, she almost did not recognize the man waiting for her. Mason Caldwell had lost weight. The mask that had made him so intimidating was gone, melted away by weeks of stillness, in something far heavier than stillness. He sat in a chair with his braced leg propped out in front of him and his crutches leaning against the wall, and he was smaller than she remembered. Not just in body, smaller in some way that went deeper than body. The arrogance was gone. The cold certainty that had radiated off him from the very first day was gone. What was left was a man who looked as though he had been hollowed out and had not yet figured out what, if anything, was supposed to fill the empty space. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "Thank you for coming," Mason said finally. His voice was rough, uncertain. "I didn't think you would." "I almost didn't," Emily said. She sat down across from him. She did not offer false warmth, but she did not offer coldness either. She simply sat calm and present and waited. Mason looked down at his hands for a long time, and then he looked up and he said the thing he had asked her here to say, and it clearly cost him more than any physical pain he had endured in those weeks. "I was wrong about you." Emily said nothing. She waited. "I've had a lot of time to think," Mason went on, the words coming slow and heavy, each one dragged up from somewhere he did not want to look. "That's the thing about lying in a bed for weeks with a leg you broke yourself. You can't run from your own head anymore. There's nowhere to go. And I've been going back over all of it. The day the list went up. The things I said in front of everybody. What I planned to do to you in that ring." He stopped and his jaw worked, and Emily could see the enormous effort it took for a man who had never once in his life admitted to being wrong. "I told myself the whole time that I was protecting my reputation. That's the story I ran in my head, but that wasn't it. That was never it. I was scared. I watched you fight, and I knew deep down I knew that you were better than me, and I couldn't stand it. 20 years I spent building myself into the strongest man on this base, and a woman I'd never met exposed the whole thing in 2 days. And instead of taking it like a man, instead of shaking your hand and admitting I'd been beaten, fair, I decided I'd rather break your leg than ever find out for certain that you could beat me." He laughed, a bitter, broken sound with no humor in it at all. "And I broke my own instead. There's a word for that. I looked it up lying in that bed. Poetic justice. Turns out the universe has a sense of humor after all." Emily was quiet for the moment, and then she spoke, and her voice was not cruel, but it was honest because she had never once lied to him, and she was not going to start now. "You didn't break your leg," she said. "Your fear broke your leg. I've been trying to tell you that since the first day without ever saying a word of it out loud. You were never fighting me, Mason. You were fighting the possibility that you weren't who you'd spent your whole life telling yourself you were. And that's a fight nobody wins. Because the harder you fight to protect a lie about yourself, the more damage you do until eventually the lie takes everything you have." She leaned forward slightly. "I saw it in you before you ever set foot in that ring. You want to know why I stayed so calm the whole time? Because I wasn't fighting a strong man. I was fighting a terrified one. And terrified men are the easiest opponents in the world because they beat themselves. I just had to stay out of the way while you did it to yourself." Mason absorbed this in silence, and something moved across his ruined face, something close to grief. "How did you learn to see people like that?" he asked. "That's not a combat skill. Nobody teaches that, not anywhere I ever trained." "My father taught me," Emily said. And for the first time in the conversation, her composure wavered just slightly, because speaking of her father still opened a place in her that had never fully healed. "He was a SEAL, 22 years, and he came home from all of it, and the thing he cared most about teaching me had nothing to do with fighting at all. He sat me down when I was 14 years old, and he told me that the strongest person in the room is never the one who hits the hardest. It's the one who knows exactly who they are, even when the whole world is screaming at them to be something else. She paused. You spent 20 years being the one who hit the hardest, Mason, and you never once found out who you were underneath all of it. That's the real tragedy of you. Not that you lost to me, that you were so busy being feared that you never got around to being known. By anyone, maybe not even by yourself. The room went silent for a long, long moment, and then Mason Caldwell, the legend, the undefeated, the man who had mocked her in front of hundreds of soldiers and sworn to break her in half, put his face in his hands and his shoulders shook, and this enormous, hollowed-out man wept. Not theatrically, not for sympathy. He wept the way a person weeps when a truth they have spent their whole life avoiding finally arrives and there is nowhere left to hide from it. Emily did not rush to comfort him. She did not tell him it was all right because it was not all right, and false comfort would have been its own kind of cruelty. But she did not leave either. She sat with him, steady and present, and she let him have the moment because everyone, even a man who had tried to cripple her, deserved the dignity of finally facing themselves without an audience watching. When he had gathered himself, Mason wiped his face with the back of his hand and looked at her, and he asked the question that had clearly been living inside him for weeks. "Why don't you hate me?" he said. "I gave you every reason in the world. I mocked you. I tried to end your career on purpose. By every right you have, you should hate me. Everyone would understand it. Nobody would blame you for a second. So why don't you?" And Emily gave him the answer that was the deepest thing she believed, the thing that had carried her through SEAL training and through classified operations and through the loss of her father and through the worst afternoon of her entire life in that ring. "Because hate would mean you still get to control how I feel," she said simply. "And I decided a very long time ago that no one gets to do that. Not you, not anyone. The moment I hate you, Mason, you win. Because it means you got inside me. It means you changed who I am. It means you made me into someone smaller and angrier than I was before I ever met you. And I am not going to hand you that. Not after everything you did." She stood up. "I don't hate you. I don't even dislike you. I feel sorry for you. And I hope honestly and truly that the man you become after all of this is better than the one who got in that ring. Because you've got a chance now that you never had before. You've lost everything you built your life on. That's the worst thing that's ever happened to you, and it might just turn out to be the best thing if you have the courage to let it teach you what it's trying to teach you." Mason looked up at him, and there were tears still on his face, and he said in a voice barely above a whisper, "I don't know how to be anyone but who I was." "Nobody does at first," Emily said gently. "That's what starting over means. You'll figure it out the same way everybody does, one honest day at a time." She moved toward the door, and then she stopped, and she turned back, and she gave him one last thing, because it was in her nature to give even when the person had done nothing to earn it. "For what it's worth, Mason, the fact that you asked me here and said what you said, that took more courage than anything you ever did in that ring. Winning a fight is easy. Admitting you were wrong when you've built your whole life on never being wrong, that's the hard one. You just did the hard one. So maybe you're stronger than you ever believed, just not in the way you always thought." And then she left, and she did not look back, and Mason Caldwell sat alone in that room with the first real chance at becoming a decent human being he had been offered in 20 years, and whether he took it or not was at last entirely up to him and no one else. Rachel was waiting outside, leaning against the car, and when Emily came out, she studied her face carefully. "Well," she said, "was it worth it?" Emily was quiet for a moment. "He apologized. He meant it. He cried." She glanced back at the recovery wing. "I don't know if he'll change. Maybe he will. Maybe he won't. That's not mine to carry anymore. But I said what I needed to say, and I walked out of there the exact same person I walked in as. That was the whole point." "That was the point," Rachel repeated slowly. "That's the only thing I was ever protecting, Rachel," Emily said, opening the car door. "Not my record, not my reputation, not my legs even. Just the person I am. And she's intact." She got in. "That's the whole game. That was always the whole game." They drove back in a comfortable silence, two soldiers who understood each other without needing to fill the air with words. But the story of what happened at Fort Liberty did not end in that recovery room, because the ripples of a single afternoon travel far, and they travel into lives you never see. And one of the deepest ripples of all traveled into the life of a 19-year-old private named Tyler Brooks. Tyler had braced himself after the investigation ended for the worst. He had informed on the base's legend. He had betrayed a superior he had once idolized. And he had fully expected when the whole story became public to be branded a snitch and frozen out to become the man nobody trusted, the private who couldn't keep his mouth shut when it counted. He had made his peace with that, more or less, because Emily had told him his parents had raised a good man, and he had decided to try to live up to that no matter what it ended up costing him. But that is not what happened, because Colonel Whitaker had meant every word he said in that office, and the colonel made sure quietly and without fanfare that the true story of what Tyler had done spread through the base as thoroughly as the false version ever might have. And the soldiers of Fort Liberty, once they understood the whole thing, once they understood that a 19-year-old private had risked his entire future to stop a premeditated assault on a fellow soldier, did not brand him a snitch. They did something Tyler never saw coming. They started treating him with respect, not the loud kind, the quiet kind, the kind that soldiers reserve for one of their own who has proven when it truly counted that he could be trusted with the only thing that really matters, which is the safety of the person standing next to him. An old sergeant major, a man with 3 decades of service and a chest full of ribbons, stopped Tyler in the mess hall one afternoon in front of everyone and shook his hand and said loud enough for the whole room to hear, "Private Brooks, I heard what you did. In 30 years, I have watched 100 men look the other way when doing the right thing got inconvenient. You didn't. When it cost you something, you still didn't. You remember this feeling, son. That right there is the feeling of being the kind of soldier other men can put their lives in the hands of. Don't you ever lose it." And Tyler Brooks, who 2 months earlier had laughed at a woman because a bully told him to stood a little straighter every single day after that. He had learned at 19 the lesson that some men served their whole careers and never managed to learn. He had learned what strength actually was, and he would carry that lesson through the rest of his service, and one day, years from now, he would sit across from some cocky young private who thought strength meant being the loudest and the meanest in the room. And Tyler would tell him the story of a woman he once watched fight, and in that way, the thing Emily's father had taught at a kitchen table would keep on traveling person to person quietly, this way the real things always travel long after everyone had forgotten the video that started it all. As for Emily, she returned to duty exactly as she had said she would. She rejoined her team. She went back to the work she could not talk about, the work that had never once required an audience, or a spotlight, or a story neatly packaged for television. And the video faded exactly as she had always known it would, replaced by the next thing, and the thing after that the way everything eventually fades. Within a few months, most people had forgotten the specifics of it entirely. But the ones who needed the lesson, the ones it was really for, they did not forget. Somewhere out there, a young woman who had been told her whole life that she didn't belong, watched that video and decided to stay in the fight one more day. Somewhere out there, a young man who had been raised to believe that strength meant domination, watched it and began, for the first time, to question everything he thought he knew. Somewhere out there, the lesson landed in the quiet way that lessons land in exactly the people who were ready to receive it. Emily never knew about most of them. She never wanted to. She had done the thing that was worth doing, and she had let it go, and she had gone back to work, and that was enough. That had always been enough. There was one more moment, though, one final piece of the story, and it happened almost a year later on a quiet evening when Emily had gone home on leave back to the house where she had grown up, the house with the garden her father had loved, the garden where he had died. She went out into that garden in the evening the way she always did when she came home, and she sat on the old bench her father had built with his own 2 hands, and she talked to him the way she had talked to him her whole life, out loud sometimes, silently others. "A lot happened this year, Dad," she said quietly to the empty garden. "You'd have hated the video part, all that noise, all those cameras. You'd have told me to ignore the whole circus and get back to work." She smiled through the ache in her chest. "So that's exactly what I did. I ignored it and I got back to work, just like you would have." The wind moved softly through the garden, stirring the leaves he had planted, and Emily was quiet for a while. "There was a man," she went on. "His name was Mason. He tried to hurt me, tried to end everything, really. And in the moment when he came at me with every bit of strength and every bit of rage he had left in him, I heard your voice, clear as anything, clear as if you were standing right there in the ring with me. Stay calm, stay in control. Let him lose his and use it. She looked up at the darkening sky, at the first stars just beginning to show. And I did, Dad. I stayed calm, even when it was as hard as it has ever been in my life. I was the one person in that whole room who didn't lose control, exactly like you always told me to be. And it held. Every single thing you taught me held. Her voice caught just slightly. I wish you could have seen it. Not the fight. You never cared about fights. I wish you could have seen that when it mattered most, when a man was trying to destroy me and the whole world was screaming. I remembered exactly who I was. Because that was your whole life's work, wasn't it? Making certain that your daughter would always, always remember who she was. And it worked. It worked perfectly. When it counted the most, I knew. She sat there a long time as the stars came out over the garden, and she felt her father close the way she always did, and she understood something in that quiet that she had not fully understood before. She understood that she had not defeated Mason Caldwell in that ring. Her father had. 12 years earlier, at a kitchen table with a lesson about who a person truly is underneath everything else. Her father had reached across time and across death and stood beside her in that ring. In every calm breath she took, in every reckless attack she chose to redirect instead of return. He had never once gone to war with Mason Caldwell. But he had won that fight all the same, because the strongest thing that Master Chief David Carter ever built in his entire life was not his own body or his own record or his own reputation. It was his daughter. And she had carried everything that he was into that ring, and she had walked out the other side exactly the person he had raised her to be. And that was the truth of the whole story, the truth that traveled out from Fort Liberty into millions of lives, the truth that a bully never understood and a young private finally learned and a broken legend was only beginning to grasp. Respect is not given because of size or reputation or the fear you can pour into other people. Respect is earned through discipline, through character, through knowing exactly who you are when everything is on the line and the entire world is trying to twist you into someone else. The strongest person in any room is never the one who hits the hardest. It is the one who stays in control when everyone else has lost it. It is the one who does not need to break others in order to feel unbroken. It is the one who knows without a shadow of a doubt exactly who they are. Emily Carter knew. She had always known. She was her father's daughter, a soldier who did her job, a warrior who never once fought to prove she was powerful because she had never once needed to. And on the day a man tried to break her in front of 500 soldiers, she did not break and she did not hate, and she did not lose herself because the man who raised her had spent his entire life making certain that she never ever would. She was a Navy SEAL. And no one, not Mason Caldwell, not 500 witnesses, not the whole watching world ever took that from her. Because it was never something she had to prove to anyone. It was simply and permanently and unbreakably who she was.